I am Joseph, 70 years old, and somehow still navigating the battlefield of my own family. My son-in-law thought I was just a broke, worn-out old man clinging to the past. He had no idea I was a retired four-star general pulling a $36,000 monthly pension. He invited me to Christmas dinner with his wealthy parents. I wore my oldest military coat simply to see how they treated a nobody. Then his father quietly slid an envelope across the table. 3 minutes later, the war officially began. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to people who underestimated your worth. Growing up in the disciplined ranks of the United States military meant I learned early how to read a room before a single shot was fired. Inside the sprawling gated estate of Jonathan and Patricia, the wealth was as loud as the people who possessed it. The heavy crystal chandelier cast a harsh, unforgiving light over their imported mahogany dining table. I sat quietly at the far end, a 70-year-old African-American man deliberately wearing the faded, olive-drab military coat I had owned since my early days at Fort Bragg. I wore it purposefully to see exactly how these people would treat a man they believed had absolutely nothing to offer. Across from me sat Gavin, my white son-in-law, projecting a completely fabricated aura of authority. He swirled his expensive bourbon, adjusting his tailored silk cuffs, while loudly boasting about his latest tech startup. Gavin never missed an opportunity to remind everyone of his supposed brilliance. He leaned forward, flashing a condescending smile in my direction. He suggested it was good I got out of the house, implying my quiet lifestyle was a symptom of decay rather than a conscious choice. He openly assumed I relied entirely on state welfare and meager Social Security checks to survive. He spoke to me slowly, using the patronizing tone one might reserve for a confused child. I remained perfectly still, resting my scarred hands on the edge of the table, maintaining absolute tactical silence while he exposed his own arrogant vulnerabilities. The real ambush did not come from Gavin, but from his father. Jonathan cleared his throat, adjusting his posture at the head of the table. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his bespoke suit jacket and pulled out a crisp white envelope. Without a shred of hesitation, he slid it slowly across the polished wood. The heavy paper stopped precisely an inch from my dinner plate. Jonathan took a sip of his vintage wine, looking down his nose at me. He stated that Gavin and Olivia needed their privacy to build their lives and expand Gavin's new business venture. He told me they had taken the liberty of securing a spot for me at a facility called Oakwood Reserve. Inside the unsealed envelope sat a glossy brochure for a low-income, state-funded nursing home tucked neatly behind a single insulting check written out for $500. Jonathan coldly demanded that I vacate my own home by the end of the month so his son could convert the residential space into a commercial office. The sheer audacity of the demand hung heavy in the dining room. They were actively carving up my life, measuring my home for their immediate profit while I was still sitting at the table. My house had been purchased in cash a decade ago through a blind trust to ensure my daughter never had to worry about a mortgage. Gavin believed he was the master of the property simply because his name was printed on the municipal utility bills. They viewed me not as a human being, but as a disposable asset cluttering up their path to rapid expansion. The cold certainty in Jonathan's voice revealed a profound level of entitlement. They fully expected me to quietly pack up my entire existence and fade into the shadows funded by a meaningless scrap of paper. I did not look at Jonathan or the insulting check. I shifted my gaze directly toward my daughter. Olivia sat perfectly still, staring intensely at her half-eaten roasted turkey. She was entirely unable to meet my eyes. That was the true agonizing casualty of the evening. The bright, fiercely independent woman I had raised single-handedly after her mother Martha passed away was completely broken. She had traded her self-respect for the illusion of high society acceptance, blindly following the arrogant fool she had married. Gavin had systematically isolated her, employing aggressive psychological control to ensure she never questioned his authority. She sat there in terrified silence, refusing to defend her own father against a blatant eviction from his own property. The betrayal burned deep in my chest, but I did not shout. I did not throw the envelope back in their faces or flip the mahogany table in a fit of rage. Decades of military tactical training immediately kicked in, freezing my emotional response and locking my mind into a state of pure strategic calculation. When faced with an enemy ambush, panic is a guaranteed death sentence. Silence is the greatest intelligence-gathering tool a man can possess. I realized instantly that Gavin's towering arrogance was a severe vulnerability. He assumed the old black man sitting quietly in the faded coat was too ignorant to understand property law, forensic accounting, or the legal structures of asset protection. He had built his entire offensive strategy on the fatal assumption that I was weak and defenseless. He was completely wrong. I watched the self-satisfied smirks on their faces and knew exactly how to dismantle their false empire. They had handed me their exact battle plan on a silver platter, completely unaware of the consequences. I quietly picked up my linen napkin, folded it with deliberate precision, and set it beside my plate. I stood up, the old fabric of my olive drab coat rustling in the quiet dining room. I reached down and calmly placed the white envelope and the $500 check into my pocket. Jonathan smirked, clearly misinterpreting my compliance as absolute surrender. He assumed I had accepted my defeat without a fight. I looked directly at him, maintaining icy, unwavering eye contact. I thanked him for the meal and promised I would make the necessary arrangements immediately. I turned my back on the silent room and walked straight out the heavy oak front door. I stepped out into the freezing December snow, pulling my collar up against the biting wind. The performance of the helpless, broken old man was officially over. I walked down the long, illuminated driveway toward my parked vehicle, my mind already mapping out the sequential destruction of their entire world. Standing in the dark shadows just beyond their iron security gates, I reached into my inner pocket. I pulled out my heavily encrypted phone, unlocking the military-grade interface. Gavin thought he could steal my home and break my daughter without facing any retaliation. He had absolutely no idea that he had just declared war on a man who commanded global logistics and wielded a $12 million war chest. I dialed the secure line of my legal counsel, ready to initiate a massive, uncompromising counterstrike. The cold winter air filled my lungs, sharpening my focus and cementing my resolve. They had drawn the battle lines using deceit and manipulation. I was about to redraw them using absolute financial devastation and the ruthless application of the law. The real war was just beginning. I sat in the driver's seat of my vehicle and let the freezing December air bite against the glass. The engine remained off. I needed the cold to keep my mind razor sharp. I pulled out my encrypted phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. It rang only once before a crisp voice answered. Thomas had served as my military adjutant for 15 years before transitioning to civilian life as a brilliant corporate attorney. He was the only man I trusted to guard my flank. I told him the initial reconnaissance was complete and that they took the bait exactly as we anticipated. I ordered him to initiate a full forensic financial sweep on Gavin and his entire tech enterprise. I reminded Thomas to utilize the highest clearance protocols. Gavin thought I was surviving on government handouts. He had absolutely no idea he was dealing with a retired 4-star general of the United States Army. He did not know that my military pension alone deposited $36,000 into my accounts every single month. More importantly, he was entirely oblivious to the $12 million blind trust I controlled. I had spent 40 years managing global military logistics, moving billions of dollars in assets across active war zones. Gavin was a pampered amateur playing a very dangerous game with a man who wrote the manual on tactical destruction. I instructed Thomas to dig into every ledger, every tax return, and every corporate filing bearing my son-in-law's name. I wanted to know exactly why Gavin was desperate enough to try and evict me from my own property. I hung up the phone and waited in the silent darkness. Less than an hour later, my phone vibrated with an incoming secure transmission. Thomas was remarkably efficient. His voice came through the speaker with absolute clinical detachment. He informed me that Gavin's highly publicized tech startup was a complete fabrication built on a mountain of debt. The company was completely bankrupt. To cover severe margin calls and hide his catastrophic failures from his wealthy parents, Gavin had taken an incredibly reckless gamble. Thomas explained that just 2 days ago, my arrogant son-in-law submitted a fraudulent commercial loan application to First National Bank. The collateral he offered for this massive injection of cash was the deed to my house. I gripped the leather steering wheel, processing the sheer audacity of the crime. The house was legally held by my private trust. Gavin could not leverage a single brick of that property without my explicit notarized authorization. I asked Thomas how a major financial institution could possibly accept such a blatant illegal transaction. The answer was chilling. Gavin had not simply walked in and asked for a loan. He had submitted a forged power of attorney document to the loan officer. He presented paperwork featuring a crude, rushed imitation of my signature granting himself absolute legal control over my entire estate. He assumed the quiet old black man sitting in the faded coat was far too ignorant to understand property law. He thought I was just another vulnerable senior citizen he could steamroll. He had committed federal wire fraud and identity theft without a second thought. The betrayal did not stop at my front door. Thomas paused, and I recognized the heavy silence of a soldier about to deliver devastating casualty reports. He confirmed that Gavin had also bypassed the security protocols on Olivia's personal banking profiles. Over the past 3 months, my son-in-law had quietly drained every single dollar from my daughter's savings accounts to fund his failing ambitions. Olivia was financially ruined, completely stripped of her safety net, and she had absolutely no knowledge of the theft. The rage that flared inside me was not a wild explosive fire. It was a cold, calculated, absolute certainty. Gavin had crossed a line that required total annihilation. I did not raise my voice. I gave Thomas his marching orders with absolute precision. I instructed him to freeze my trust immediately and flag the forged power of attorney with the Federal Banking Commission. However, I explicitly ordered him not to alert Gavin or the local branch of First National Bank. If we triggered the alarms prematurely, Gavin might panic and attempt to flee the country or destroy the remaining digital evidence. We needed to let him walk blindly into the snare. I wanted him to believe his fraudulent loan was going to clear. I wanted him to taste victory right up until the exact moment the steel trap snapped shut around his neck. Thomas acknowledged the orders and disconnected the line. The battlefield was set. I turned the ignition key, the engine roaring to life in the quiet neighborhood. I drove back to my house, mentally preparing for the war that would inevitably arrive on my doorstep. I slept lightly that night, my internal clock resting easily on the familiar rhythm of impending conflict. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when the aggressive sound of heavy boots echoed through my hardwood hallway. I was sitting in the kitchen drinking my black coffee when the front door burst open. Gavin marched directly into my home, projecting absolute false authority. He was not alone. Right behind him stood a muscular construction contractor wearing a neon vest and holding a heavy steel sledgehammer. Gavin pointed an arrogant finger toward my private study, completely ignoring the fact that I was sitting right there. He loudly ordered the contractor to start tearing down the load-bearing walls, bragging that he needed the space converted into a modern executive suite by the end of the week. Then he turned his cold, entitled glare toward me. He slapped his hands on the kitchen counter and demanded to know why my bags were not packed for the nursing home. He smugly announced that his equity check was clearing by noon and ordered me to get out of his house immediately. Gavin stood in the center of my kitchen like a conquering emperor who had never seen a day of actual combat. He pointed a dismissive finger toward the heavy oak double doors of my private study. He loudly instructed the burly contractor to tear down the load-bearing walls immediately. Gavin bragged that he needed an expansive open-concept executive suite to impress his new tech investors by the end of the week. The contractor hesitated. He gripped the worn handle of his sledgehammer and glanced nervously at me, clearly uncomfortable with the hostile family dynamic unfolding in front of him. Gavin snapped his fingers and barked at the working man to follow orders, reminding him who was supposedly signing the checks. He then turned his cold, entitled glare directly toward me. He leaned heavily against the imported granite countertop, a smug smirk twisting his face. He demanded to know why my bags were not packed for the state-funded nursing home yet. He confidently announced that his massive equity loan check secured entirely by my stolen property was clearing the bank by noon today. He claimed that the exact moment those funds hit his corporate account, my legal right to step foot on this property evaporated completely. He told me to stop dragging my feet, swallow my pride, and call a cheap cab before he ordered the contractor to physically throw my belongings onto the freezing front lawn. His arrogance was suffocating. It was built entirely on stolen money, fabricated authority, and forged signatures. He thought he held all the cards. He truly believed he had successfully neutralized the old man. I did not give him the satisfaction of a petty screaming match. A seasoned military commander never engages an enemy on highly unfavorable terrain. I stood up slowly from the kitchen stool, matching his aggressive, chaotic energy with absolute unnerving silence. I walked deliberately past him, keeping my posture completely rigid, and entered my bedroom. I pulled a durable tactical overnight bag from the top shelf of my closet. I packed exactly 3 tailored charcoal suits, a leather shaving kit, and my classified military-grade encryption tablet. Decades of leading global deployments had taught me exactly how to strip my life down to the absolute bare essentials in under 5 minutes. When I walked back out into the main hallway, the contractor had lowered his sledgehammer to the floor. The heavy, calculated silence I carried seemed to deeply unsettle the working man. He recognized the quiet danger of a man who was not afraid, but Gavin was entirely blind to it. My silence only fueled my son-in-law's grand, narcissistic delusion. Gavin laughed out loud. It was a harsh, triumphant sound that echoed off the expensive hardwood floors I had paid for. He mockingly told me to enjoy the terrible cafeteria food at the low-income facility. I did not offer a single word of rebuttal or defend my wounded pride. I walked straight out the front door, stepping into the crisp morning air, and unlocked my vehicle. I drove away from my home of 10 years without a single backward glance. I was not retreating in defeat. I was deliberately abandoning a compromised battlefield to reposition my forces for a devastating, inescapable counteroffensive. I drove straight into the bustling heart of the downtown financial district. I bypassed the crowded, noisy lobby of the Grand Monarch Hotel and took the private VIP elevator directly to the top floor. I had booked their executive penthouse suite an hour earlier, establishing a highly secure elevated command post perfectly situated just 3 blocks away from the First National Bank branch. I set my tactical bag on the polished mahogany desk, sat in the leather executive chair, and opened my encrypted tablet. Thomas was already on the secure line waiting for my final operational signal. I authorized him to execute the terminal phase of the operation. Thomas confirmed that 2 seasoned federal financial investigators were actively monitoring Gavin's fraudulent loan application from a secure government server room. We watched the digital grid light up on my screen as Gavin impatiently attempted to force the massive equity transfer through the banking portal. I ordered Thomas to let the transaction process just up to the final authorization gate. I wanted to keep the fragile illusion of victory alive for Gavin for just a few more minutes. Then we dropped the heavy steel hammer. Thomas initiated a comprehensive total federal freeze. We locked a massive digital net around every single routing number, SWIFT code, and offshore shell account attached to Gavin's name. We severed his access to the forged equity loan, instantly blocked his personal corporate credit lines, and permanently locked the funds he had maliciously stolen from my daughter. His entire financial existence was systematically erased in less than 60 seconds. I stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the hotel penthouse, looking out over the sprawling, snow-covered city skyline. The trap was perfectly sprung. There was absolutely no escape route left for the arrogant boy who had tried to steal my legacy and destroy my family. The heavy silence of the luxury suite was suddenly shattered by the sharp, piercing ring of my secondary burner phone. I answered the call immediately. It was Olivia. My brilliant, beautiful daughter was sobbing hysterically, her voice trembling in absolute raw panic. She could barely form a coherent sentence through her frantic tears. She cried out that they were trapped inside the downtown branch of First National Bank. She explained that Gavin had proudly marched up to the teller window to withdraw the massive equity check, but the bank screens instantly flashed a critical federal warning. The branch manager had triggered a silent alarm under his desk. The heavy bulletproof security doors of the main lobby were physically locked from the outside by armed guards trapping everyone inside. Olivia wept frantically, telling me that every single account Gavin possessed was frozen under an active federal forgery investigation. She said Gavin was currently screaming at the top of his lungs at the bank executives. He was violently slamming his fists against the reinforced glass, demanding his money while completely unaware that federal agents were already surrounding the perimeter of the building. He was facing imminent arrest, and he had dragged my innocent daughter directly into the center of the blast radius. I disconnected the call with Olivia and placed my burner phone on the mahogany desk. The time for tactical observation had officially expired. It was time to engage the enemy on the front lines. I unbuttoned the faded olive drab military coat I had worn to their Christmas dinner and left it draped over the back of the hotel chair. I opened my tactical bag and pulled out my armor for the afternoon. I dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit tailored perfectly to my frame. I fastened a solid gold tie clip, adjusted my cuffs, and polished my leather Oxfords until they caught the light of the penthouse windows. I looked in the mirror. The broke, worn-out old man they thought they could easily discard was entirely gone. Staring back at me was a titan of authority, a man who had commanded theaters of war and managed billions in global assets. I walked out of the hotel suite and took the elevator down to the lobby. The winter wind was sharp as I stepped onto the downtown pavement, but I did not feel the cold. I walked the 3 blocks toward the First National Bank branch with deliberate, measured steps. Every stride built the tension. I was not rushing to save a panicked son-in-law. I was marching to execute a precise, overwhelming strike against a man who had foolishly believed he could steal my legacy. I reached the heavy glass doors of the First National Bank and paused for a brief moment to assess the battlefield. Through the reinforced windows, I could see absolute chaos unfolding in the main lobby. The entire banking floor had been locked down by armed security guards standing rigidly by the exits. In the center of the room, Gavin was sweating profusely. His designer suit jacket was discarded on a waiting room chair, and his tie was violently loosened around his neck. He was aggressively slamming his fists against the bulletproof glass of the teller counter, screaming at a terrified bank employee who was frantically typing on a keyboard. Right beside him stood his father, Jonathan. The older man was throwing his weight around completely unhinged. He was barking empty corporate threats at the branch manager, demanding they release the funds immediately. Jonathan loudly threatened to buy the entire bank branch just so he could personally fire every single person in the room. He pointed an aggressive finger at the security guards, completely oblivious to the fact that his arrogant intimidation tactics meant absolutely nothing against a federal mandate. And then I saw my daughter. Olivia stood completely isolated in the far corner of the lobby. She was clutching her leather purse tightly against her chest in absolute terror. Her face was pale and tears streamed down her cheeks as she watched her husband devolve into a frantic criminal cornered animal. She looked entirely broken, humiliated by the public spectacle Gavin was creating. He did not check on her once. He was entirely consumed by the collapsing illusion of his stolen wealth, desperately trying to salvage a fortune that had never actually belonged to him. The complete lack of regard for his wife in his moment of panic solidified my absolute lack of mercy. I pushed through the heavy glass doors, the sound of the hinges drawing the immediate attention of the entire room. The moment Jonathan saw me step onto the marble floor, his face twisted into a mask of pure aristocratic disdain. He sneered, taking a step away from the teller counter to confront me. He loudly demanded to know what I was doing there, attempting to humiliate me publicly in front of the banking staff. He called me a delusional old fool, shouting that this was a highly sensitive financial matter involving real money, and that I had absolutely no business being anywhere near it. He turned to the nearest armed security guard and aggressively ordered him to remove the broke old man from the premises immediately. Gavin barely even registered my presence, too consumed by his panic to realize his entire executioner had just arrived. I did not blink, nor did I break my stride. I walked calmly toward the center of the lobby, stopping just a few feet away from Jonathan. Before the security guard could even take a single step in my direction, the heavy glass doors behind me swung open again. Thomas stepped into the bank lobby. He looked sharp, commanding, and entirely professional. Flanking my trusted legal counsel were two federal financial investigators wearing dark official windbreakers with government insignias clearly visible on their chests. They moved with the undeniable authority of federal law enforcement, their presence instantly silencing Jonathan's arrogant screaming. Thomas held a thick, heavily stamped folder in his right hand. He locked eyes with the branch manager, projecting a level of power that completely dwarfed Jonathan's empty corporate threats. The trap had been completely sealed, and the enemy was effectively surrounded on all sides. The entire atmospheres in the room shifted instantly. The suffocating tension of Gavin and Jonathan's aggressive tantrums vanished, replaced immediately by the cold, heavy reality of federal intervention. The terrified branch manager wiped the sweat from his brow and stepped out from behind the bulletproof teller enclosure. He completely bypassed a furious Jonathan, ignoring the wealthy businessman as if he were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. The manager walked directly up to me. He stopped, abruptly, snapped to perfect attention, and straightened his posture with profound respect. He addressed me clearly and loudly as General, his voice echoing off the high marble ceilings for everyone to hear. He formally stated that it was an absolute honor to have me in their branch and confirmed that all of my direct operational orders regarding the fraudulent wire transfers had been executed with absolute precision. The title hung in the air like a detonation. General. Jonathan's mouth opened slightly, his arrogant tirade dying instantly in his throat as his brain struggled to process the sudden shift in the power dynamic. But it was Gavin's reaction that truly secured the victory. My son-in-law slowly turned away from the teller glass. He looked at the branch manager, then at the federal investigators, and finally he looked directly at me. The bespoke suit, the gold tie clip, the unwavering posture of a man who commanded entire global theaters of war. Gavin took a slow, trembling step backward. The color drained entirely from his face, leaving him pale and wide-eyed. In that single shattering moment, the arrogant boy finally realized the sheer magnitude of the man he had just attempted to defraud. His knees visibly weakened as the crushing weight of his catastrophic mistake crashed down upon him. He was not dealing with a vulnerable senior citizen, he was dealing with his absolute destruction. I closed the final few feet between myself and Jonathan, stepping directly into his personal space. He instinctively recoiled, the arrogant sneer wiped completely from his face as he stared up at me. I reached inside the breast pocket of my tailored jacket and extracted a thick, notarized document bearing the official seal of the state. With a swift, deliberate motion, I slammed the physical deed to my property down onto the cold marble counter. The sharp slap of paper hitting stone echoed across the silent banking floor. I looked him dead in the eye and projected my voice with the undeniable command I had honed over 4 decades. I stated that I had served 40 years in the United States Army, retiring as a 4-star general. I informed him that I collected a monthly pension of $36,000 and personally managed a private investment portfolio valued in excess of $12 million. The numbers hit the wealthy businessman like physical blows. He stared at me in stunned silence, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. I leaned in slightly, dropping my voice to a lethal, quiet register. I told him that my blind trust did not just own the house his son currently occupied. I revealed that my holding company was the primary landlord for the massive commercial warehouse where Jonathan operated his entire logistics empire. I owned the very ground his business stood on. The absolute gravity of his miscalculation finally crushed Gavin. The arrogant posture he had maintained for years evaporated in a matter of seconds. His shoulders slumped, his chest heaving as he struggled to pull air into his lungs. He looked at the heavy federal folder in Thomas's hand and realized his carefully constructed tech startup facade was completely destroyed. Gavin raised his shaking hands, sweating profusely under the bright lobby lights, and began to stammer the most pathetic string of excuses I had ever heard. He frantically claimed that the fraudulent application was just a temporary bridge loan to keep his company afloat. He promised repeatedly that he was going to pay every single cent back the moment his new investors signed their contracts. He practically tripped over his own expensive shoes as he stumbled forward, begging me for mercy. He admitted his guilt in front of the entire banking staff, confessing that he forged my signature out of sheer desperation because he could not bear the shame of bankruptcy. The 2 federal financial investigators did not wait for his apology to finish. They stepped forward in unison, completely flanking my son-in-law. One agent firmly grabbed Gavin by his left arm, physically securing him in place, while the other pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. Gavin gasped, his eyes darting wildly around the room as the cold metal clamped tightly around his wrists. He pleaded with me to make them stop crying out that he was family and that we could resolve this quietly behind closed doors. I did not move a single muscle to help him. I stared down at the broken boy who had gleefully handed me a brochure for a low-income nursing home just 48 hours earlier. I told him he had made his choice when he evaluated my worth based on a faded military coat, and now he would face the full weight of the federal justice system. Jonathan watched his son being physically restrained, but his eyes quickly darted down to the property deed resting on the marble counter. The sheer panic washing over his face had absolutely nothing to do with Gavin's impending incarceration. Jonathan had just realized that his own lucrative business lease was in immediate jeopardy. His logistics company relied entirely on that central warehouse, and if I chose to terminate his tenancy, his empire would collapse within a month. He reached frantically into his tailored jacket and pulled out a leather-bound checkbook. His hands shook as he uncapped a gold fountain pen. He tried to bribe me right there at the teller counter, his voice cracking with desperation. He frantically offered to write me a blank check to cover the entirety of Gavin's debts, pleading with me to call off the federal investigators and keep the authorities out of their lives. He promised to make the scandal disappear, insisting that wealthy men like us could settle our differences quietly without involving the law. I looked at the trembling checkbook and felt a profound wave of disgust. I coldly rejected his pathetic bribe, pushing his hand away with absolute disdain. I told him that my honor was not a commodity to be bought and sold on a bank counter. I had spent my entire life defending the laws of this nation, and I would not compromise my integrity to save a common thief. I condemned Jonathan right there in the open lobby, staring intensely into his terrified eyes. I told him that his wealth had completely blinded him to basic morality. He had raised a weak, entitled son who believed he could steal from his own family to fund a fraudulent lifestyle. I made it absolutely clear that no amount of money in his bank accounts could repair the catastrophic damage his arrogance had caused. He had created this disaster, and now he would be forced to watch it tear his legacy apart. The federal agents formally informed Gavin of his rights, their voices loud and authoritative over the stunned silence of the bank staff. They spun him around and began marching him forcefully toward the heavy glass exit doors. Gavin sobbed uncontrollably, twisting his neck to look back at his father. He begged Jonathan to call their corporate lawyers, pleading for someone to stop the agents from dragging him into the back of a federal vehicle. Jonathan did not lift a finger to help his child. Instead of rushing to his son's defense, the wealthy businessman turned his back on the entire scene. Driven by pure cowardice and an overwhelming need to save his own skin, Jonathan fled the branch. He sprinted out the side exit in utter disgrace, completely abandoning his son to the authorities. The sight of a father discarding his own blood to protect his corporate interests was the ultimate proof of their moral bankruptcy. I stood quietly on the marble floor, watching the flashing red and blue lights of the federal vehicles illuminate the snowy street outside. The immediate threat had been entirely neutralized, and the banking floor slowly began to breathe again. I felt a small measure of satisfaction, but my tactical training refused to let me drop my guard. The battle was won, but the war was far from over. Thomas stepped up closely beside me, his eyes locked on the side door where Jonathan had just escaped. He lowered his voice to a highly classified whisper, leaning in so the remaining bank staff could not hear him. He warned me that Jonathan was an incredibly dangerous man when backed into a corner. Thomas explained that the arrogant businessman had deep, established political connections throughout the state and a payroll full of corrupt officials. He warned me that Jonathan would retaliate ruthlessly to protect his family name and his logistics empire. The initial strike was flawless, but the real retaliation was just beginning. The flashing red and blue lights of the federal vehicles slowly faded into the snowy afternoon. The heavy glass doors of the First National Bank closed, sealing out the bitter wind and the chaotic noise of the street. Inside the sprawling marble lobby, the terrified bank executives quickly retreated to their glass-walled offices, eager to distance themselves from the catastrophic fallout. The vast room emptied, leaving only Thomas, myself, and my daughter. Olivia remained standing perfectly still in the far corner. Her hands were gripping her leather purse so tightly her knuckles had turned completely white. She was staring at the empty space where federal agents had just physically restrained her husband. The realization that the man she married was a calculating, remorseless criminal had entirely shattered her reality. She looked incredibly fragile, like a structure stripped of its foundational support. I took a deep breath, consciously shifting my posture. I dropped the cold, hardened exterior of the military tactician. I needed to be a father. I walked toward her with slow, deliberate steps, ensuring my presence projected profound paternal gentleness rather than intimidating authority. When I reached her, I reached inside my tailored suit jacket and pulled out a slim blue folder. I held it out to her. She looked at it with wide, fearful eyes, clearly expecting another devastating financial blow. I spoke softly, telling her to open it. I explained that Thomas had monitored the fraudulent banking portals the moment we launched the counteroffensive. We had successfully intercepted the international wire transfers Gavin initiated that morning. I told her to look at the certified bank statements inside the folder. Every single dollar of her personal savings had been fully recovered and transferred into a secure, impenetrable account under her sole control. Olivia opened the blue folder with trembling hands. She stared down at the highlighted numbers, proving her financial independence was completely intact. The dam holding back her emotions instantly broke. The heavy folder slipped from her grasp, scattering onto the marble floor. She collapsed forward, burying her face against my chest, sobbing with a raw, agonizing intensity. I wrapped my arms securely around her shoulders, holding her tightly, just as I had when she was a frightened child. Through her frantic tears, the dark, suffocating reality of her marriage finally spilled out into the open. She confessed that her silence at the Christmas dinner was not born of disrespect, but of deep, cultivated terror. Gavin had spent the last 8 months running a systematic campaign of psychological isolation. He had slowly cut off her communication with her closest friends and meticulously planted seeds of extreme doubt regarding my mental stability. Olivia wept as she detailed how Gavin would intentionally hide my house keys, delete voicemails from my phone, and rearrange items in my kitchen to manufacture evidence of my supposed cognitive decline. He aggressively gaslighted her, shouting her down whenever she questioned his narrative, ultimately convincing her that her father was rapidly losing his mind to aggressive early-onset dementia. He made her believe that forcing me into that state-funded nursing home was an act of necessary mercy. The psychological abuse was fully laid bare in the echoing bank lobby. I listened to the sheer cruelty of his manipulation, realizing Gavin had not merely attempted to steal my $12 million trust. He had deliberately rewritten reality to steal my daughter's loyalty. He had weaponized her love and weaponized my age, turning her compassion into a tool for his own financial gain. I held my daughter as the final remnants of Gavin's toxic influence washed away in her tears. Holding her shaking frame, my mind pulled back to a promise I had made over 3 decades ago. I had stood by a hospital bed holding Martha's hand as she took her final breath. I swore to my late wife that I would raise our daughter to be a fiercely independent, unbreakable woman. I had navigated the intensely demanding ranks of the United States Army as a single father, ensuring Olivia never lacked the discipline and love required to thrive in a harsh world. I absolutely refused to let a weak, arrogant thief destroy the spirit Martha and I had carefully built. I pulled back slightly, placing my hands firmly on her shoulders to ensure she met my gaze. I wiped a tear from her cheek and spoke with absolute, unwavering conviction. I told her that Gavin targeted her not because she was inherently weak, but because her deep capacity for trust was a highly valuable resource he lacked. I firmly counseled her that true self-respect does not mean avoiding conflict. True self-respect requires establishing hard, impenetrable boundaries against toxic manipulation. I told her that predators like Gavin thrive in the dark spaces created by silence and manufactured shame. She had to recognize her own profound worth and never allow another human being to dictate her reality or isolate her from the people who truly loved her. Her voice mattered, her intuition was valid, and she must never permit anyone to silence her again. Olivia listened to my words, her breathing slowly stabilizing. The deep fog of psychological abuse that had clouded her judgment for months was finally lifting. She wiped her eyes, her posture visibly straightening as she absorbed the unvarnished truth. She nodded firmly, a spark of the resilient woman I had raised reigniting in her expression. She bent down, gathered the scattered banking documents, and secured the blue folder tightly under her arm. She was ready to reclaim absolute control over her life. We turned toward the heavy glass doors and exited the First National Bank together. Stepping out onto the snow-covered pavement, we walked side by side, united as father and daughter for the first time in what felt like years. The bitter winter wind felt entirely different now. The immediate threat had been neutralized, and a profound sense of clarity guided our steps toward the waiting town car. Just as Thomas reached forward to open the rear passenger door, the secure silence was shattered. My military-grade encrypted phone chimed with a blaring red-level emergency alert. Thomas's own device buzzed simultaneously. My legal counsel checked the digital readout, his professional demeanor hardening instantly. The retaliatory strike he had warned me about had arrived with terrifying speed. Jonathan had not merely fled in disgrace to hide in his corporate boardroom. Utilizing his deep political payroll, the wealthy businessman had just filed an emergency ex parte motion with a notoriously corrupt county judge. The digital filing claimed I was suffering from severe violent dementia. Jonathan was seeking an immediate binding medical injunction to invalidate his son's federal arrest warrants and legally seize complete control of my trust assets. The war had just escalated to the highest judicial level. The red alert on my encrypted device flashed with undeniable urgency, casting a harsh glow across the luxurious hotel suite. I handed the phone directly to Thomas. My legal counsel scanned the digital readout and his jaw visibly tightened. He looked up, his expression hardening into absolute professional focus as he processed the incoming intelligence. He informed me that Jonathan had not wasted a single second grieving his son's devastating arrest. Instead, the wealthy businessman had immediately leveraged his deep political connections to launch a catastrophic legal counterstrike. Jonathan had filed an emergency ex parte motion with a notoriously corrupt county judge who was known for favoring the local elite. The legal filing claimed I was suffering from severe violent dementia and posed an immediate, unpredictable threat to myself and my family. Thomas paced the floor of the penthouse, explaining the ruthless tactical objective behind the lie. If Jonathan could successfully establish emergency legal guardianship over me, he could instantly invalidate the federal fraud charges against Gavin. He could legally unfreeze the $12 million trust, dismiss my attorneys, and force me into a secure, locked psychiatric facility for the rest of my natural life. To execute this sinister strategy, Jonathan had bypassed standard medical protocols. He had directly hired Dr. Hoffman, a highly unethical private psychiatrist known throughout the city for providing whatever lucrative diagnosis his wealthy clients paid for. The corrupt judge had already signed the aggressive order mandating my immediate forced psychological evaluation. The enemy was attempting to strip me of my fundamental human rights. Less than 20 minutes later, heavy fists pounded aggressively against the double doors of my hotel penthouse. I walked over and opened the door to find 4 armed county sheriff deputies standing tightly together in the hallway. They had their hands resting cautiously on their tactical belts, their stances wide and defensive. They had clearly been briefed by Jonathan's legal team to expect a highly volatile, aggressive, and deeply confused elderly man who might lash out physically. One deputy stepped forward holding a mandatory medical subpoena tightly in his hand, entirely ready to physically restrain me if I offered even a fraction of resistance. I did not give them a single reason to escalate the situation. 4 decades of commanding high-stakes military operations had taught me that absolute discipline is the ultimate weapon against manufactured chaos. I knew perfectly well that shouting, arguing, or demanding my constitutional rights would instantly be documented as erratic, senile aggression. It would hand Jonathan the exact medical narrative he desperately needed to lock me away. I stepped back, opened the door wider, and calmly accepted the heavy stack of legal documents. I spoke to the deputies with a smooth, commanding baritone demonstrating total cognitive awareness and absolute situational control. My pristine, tailored charcoal suit and unwavering, confident eye contact visibly confused the young officers. They quickly realized they were not dealing with a fragile, fading dementia patient. I quietly packed my leather briefcase, ensuring my classified military documents were securely tucked inside the main compartment. I agreed to follow them to the medical facility voluntarily, completely stripping them of any legal justification to use physical force against me. I rode in the back of the county cruiser in absolute silence, watching the snowy city streets pass by while I finalized my counter-strategy. The deputies escorted me to Dr. Hoffman's private clinic, located on the affluent, highly gentrified north side of the city. The environment was intentionally designed to be deeply intimidating and entirely disorienting. The waiting room was sterile, uncomfortably cold, and entirely devoid of any welcoming comfort, purposefully built to make vulnerable senior citizens feel isolated and helpless. The fluorescent lighting buzzed with a low headache-inducing hum. A silent nurse ushered me into a large, imposing office at the end of a long hallway. Dr. Hoffman sat behind a massive, polished mahogany desk, wearing a patronizing, overly confident smile that barely concealed his underlying financial greed. He did not bother to greet me with any standard medical professionalism or common courtesy. He immediately launched into a rapid-fire, highly aggressive interrogation. He asked leading, complex, and deeply manipulative questions specifically engineered to provoke a furious, defensive outburst. He accused me of harboring dangerous, paranoid delusions about my son-in-law's business practices. He aggressively challenged my memory of the Christmas dinner, attempting to twist my strategic silence at the table into undeniable evidence of cognitive failure. He repeatedly interrupted me mid-sentence, trying to frustrate my train of thought and goad me into raising my voice in anger. I did not take the bait. I sat perfectly still in the expensive leather guest chair, keeping my posture rigidly straight and my hands folded calmly in my lap. I actively controlled my breathing, lowering my heart rate to a steady, resting operational level. I answered every single one of his manipulative questions with chilling, calculated, monotone precision. I provided exact dates, specific times, and precise financial figures, completely neutralizing his pathetic attempts to confuse me. My absolute lack of emotional volatility deeply unsettled the corrupt physician. Dr. Hoffman quickly realized his psychological ambush was completely failing to produce the desired results. Frustrated by my impenetrable composure and my absolute refusal to act like a broken victim, he dropped the fake facade of the caring medical professional entirely. He leaned back aggressively in his expensive leather chair, let out a loud theatrical sigh of manufactured disappointment, and picked up his heavy gold fountain pen. He looked at me with cold, unyielding arrogance and stated that my severe lack of emotional response was actually a textbook, undeniable symptom of advanced psychological deterioration. He smugly announced that despite my articulate answers, he was officially diagnosing me with severe paranoia and rapid onset dementia. He proudly declared that he was signing the binding legal affidavits right then and there to transfer my total permanent guardianship directly over to Jonathan. He truly believed he had won the war for his wealthy employer. I did not flinch, nor did I break eye contact. I reached calmly into my leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavy folder marked with bright red top-secret federal clearance seals. I slid the classified military medical dossier slowly across the polished desk. It stopped exactly an inch from his hovering gold pen. Before Dr. Hoffman could even look down at the file to comprehend what was happening, the heavy wooden door connecting to the adjoining private waiting room swung open. Two highly decorated, board-certified military psychiatrists stepped confidently into the office. They wore full tactical dress uniforms and carried sophisticated digital recording equipment. They possessed a flawless, high-definition secret recording of the entire corrupt session. They had captured every single manipulative tactic and leading question on tape, securing the absolute destruction of his lucrative medical career. Dr. Hoffman stared at the two board-certified military psychiatrists with absolute unadulterated horror. His polished confidence vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, rising panic as he realized the magnitude of his trap. The senior military psychiatrist stepped forward, placing a high-end digital recorder directly on the mahogany desk between them. With clinical precision, the doctor hit play, filling the sterile office with the crisp, unmistakable audio of Hoffman's entire corrupt session. The recording broadcasted every single manipulative question, every leading prompt, and every intentional trap the psychiatrist had laid to provoke a false response. The military doctor systematically dismantled Hoffman's fake diagnosis point by point, citing specific violations of federal medical ethics, psychiatric board regulations, and standard evaluation protocols. He pointed out how Hoffman had ignored cognitive baseline metrics, bypassed objective memory assessments, and actively steered the conversation toward a predetermined, malicious outcome. The clinical evidence was undeniable, exposing the diagnosis not as a medical conclusion, but as a fraudulent weapon fabricated for financial gain. Hoffman sat paralyzed, his mouth slightly open, entirely stripped of his professional defense as his own voice condemned him. I did not give the disgraced physician a single moment to recover his composure. I reached back into my leather briefcase and slid a second, highly specific document across the polished desk. It was a certified financial ledger containing forensic offshore banking records obtained through military intelligence channels. The document clearly mapped out an electronic wire transfer of $50,000 routed from a corporate shell company controlled by Jonathan directly into a private unlisted offshore account registered under Hoffman's personal name. The transaction date coincided precisely with the week Jonathan filed his emergency ex parte motion. The financial trail was airtight, connecting the corrupt medical evaluation directly to a textbook case of bribery and judicial tampering. Cornered by an impenetrable wall of evidence, Hoffman began sweating profusely. Large beads of moisture formed on his forehead, rolling down his pale cheeks as he stared at the financial proof. The threat of total professional ruin loomed heavily over the room. He knew that losing his medical license meant the permanent end of his affluent lifestyle, his prestige, and his lucrative private clinic. Worse still, the involvement of federal financial crimes and bribery carried a mandatory prison sentence. The arrogant physician who had swaggered into the room believing he held absolute power over my life was suddenly reduced to a terrified, cornered criminal desperate to find any escape route from the federal net closing in around him. Dr. Hoffman completely flipped. The psychological barrier protecting his illicit enterprise shattered under the sheer weight of federal prison time and the loss of his livelihood. He slumped forward in his leather chair, his hands trembling violently as he grabbed his gold fountain pen. He began pleading for leniency, stammering desperate promises to cooperate fully with any federal investigation in exchange for professional immunity. I signaled Thomas, who immediately stepped forward with a pre-drafted legal document prepared precisely for this contingency. Hoffman did not hesitate. He hastily signed a comprehensive sworn legal affidavit confessing to the entire bribery scheme. The sworn statement detailed every single instruction Jonathan had transmitted, explicitly outlining the wealthy businessman's demand to fabricate a diagnosis of severe dementia regardless of my actual cognitive health. It was a complete, unvarnished confession of conspiracy, fraud, and judicial subversion. I looked down at the signed affidavit verifying the legal seals and signatures. It was an absolute smoking gun. However, instead of rushing to hand it over to the county authorities immediately, I instructed Thomas to secure the document and place it under an immediate federal seal. I explained my tactical reasoning with cold precision. I wanted to let Jonathan walk blindly into the upcoming court hearing, completely unaware that his primary medical witness had already turned against him. I planned to let Jonathan commit absolute, unmitigated perjury in front of the judge before dropping the sealed affidavit like a tactical explosive. With the corrupt physician thoroughly neutralized and legally bound to absolute secrecy, I gathered my briefcase and walked out of the sterile medical clinic. The mission was executed with absolute surgical precision, completely dismantling Jonathan's primary line of attack before it could even reach the courtroom docket. I returned to the Grand Monarch Hotel penthouse, victorious, feeling the reassuring weight of the sealed affidavit safely secured in my tactical bag. The city skyline outside the massive floor-to-ceiling windows looked crisp and clear against the winter sky, reflecting the steady restoration of absolute order. I poured myself a cup of black coffee, reviewing the final steps of our master plan to ensure no defensive gaps remained open. Just as I settled into the executive chair to brief Thomas on the next phase of our counteroffensive, the private elevator chime echoed softly through the luxury suite. The heavy double doors parted, and Olivia stepped into the penthouse. Her expression was pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and intense urgency. In her hands, she clutched a heavy, shattered leather briefcase that belonged entirely to Gavin. She had apparently returned to their marital home to retrieve some of her personal belongings and had discovered the hidden compartment during a thorough search of her husband's private study. Without saying a word, she hurried across the luxury suite and placed the broken briefcase on the mahogany desk in front of me. Inside a cleverly concealed false bottom lining, she had uncovered two items that completely changed the tactical landscape. A prepaid burner phone pulsing with unread encrypted alerts, and a secondary high-end international passport registered entirely under a completely different alias. Olivia walked slowly across the expansive luxury penthouse, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor, and placed the shattered leather briefcase directly onto the center of the mahogany desk. Her hands were shaking violently as she pulled back a torn flap of the interior fabric, revealing a cleverly concealed false bottom. She reached inside and pulled out two items that completely shifted the entire tactical landscape of this war. She placed a prepaid burner phone and a pristine international passport on the polished wood. I picked up the passport first. It featured Gavin's photograph, but it was registered under a completely fabricated alias. My daughter stood frozen, her breathing shallow and ragged, as she stared at the burner phone pulsing with unread encrypted alerts. I handed the device directly to Thomas. Decades of military intelligence work had made him an absolute master of digital extraction. He connected the prepaid phone to his secured tactical laptop. He utilized a sophisticated decryption protocol, bypassing Gavin's simple numerical passcode in less than 90 seconds. The screen illuminated the dim room, instantly populating with hundreds of hidden text messages. Thomas scrolled through the digital logs with clinical precision. He announced that the messages spanned over 8 months. They were entirely between my son-in-law and a woman named Valerie. The explicit, highly affectionate tone of the communication confirmed the devastating reality of Gavin's double life. He had been conducting a long-term, carefully hidden affair right beneath my daughter's nose. The betrayal ran far deeper than a simple physical affair. Thomas mirrored the text messages onto the large digital monitor mounted on the penthouse wall so we could analyze the raw intelligence together. The words glowing on the screen exposed a deeply sinister, meticulously calculated secondary plot. Gavin was never actually trying to fund a legitimate technology startup. His entire business venture was a massive, fraudulent vehicle designed to launder money and siphon wealth. The text messages laid out his exact exit strategy with terrifying clarity. He was actively liquidating the equity from my $12 million trust and simultaneously draining every single cent of Olivia's personal savings. He intended to convert all of those stolen assets into untraceable cryptocurrency and offshore bearer bonds. Valerie was not just a mistress, She was a fully informed accomplice coordinating the logistical details of their escape. Gavin had promised her a life of absolute luxury, fueled by the millions he was actively bleeding from my personal accounts and the fraudulent equity loans. The messages detailed their booked private charter flights and their secured offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. They were planning to vanish without a trace by the end of the month. The sheer cruelty of the escape plan was the most chilling aspect of the entire operation. Gavin had intentionally structured the fraudulent commercial loans and the shell company tax documents entirely under Olivia's social security number. He was not merely planning to steal her money and abandon her, he was actively setting her up to take the absolute full fall for his federal crimes. When he disappeared to the Caribbean with his mistress, my daughter would be left entirely alone to shoulder massive unpayable tax liabilities. She would be the primary target for federal prosecutors and aggressive banking debt collectors, facing certain bankruptcy and potential prison time while Gavin lived like a king on a tropical beach. I watched my daughter read the cold, unforgiving words projected on the digital monitor. The sheer calculated cruelty of the betrayal finally severed the last remaining threads of her emotional attachment to the man she had married. The tears of shock dried up completely, replaced by a hardening, undeniable anger. The toxic illusion Gavin had built around her shattered permanently. She finally saw him not as a troubled husband who made a bad business decision, but as a predatory parasite who had actively planned her total destruction. She squared her shoulders, lifted her chin, and told me she wanted him to burn. I nodded, absolutely ready to oblige her request. I turned to Thomas and gave the order to escalate our offensive. I utilized my extensive military intelligence network, tapping into a highly secure global tracking database. I provided Thomas with Valerie's specific cell phone number, which we pulled directly from the encrypted contact logs stored on Gavin's abandoned burner device. We initiated a silent, untraceable ping to locate the physical coordinates of the target. The sophisticated software triangulated the active cellular signal bouncing off the local municipal towers with absolute precision. Within 20 minutes, a glowing red dot appeared on the digital map displayed on our monitor. We pinpointed her exact physical location. Valerie was currently sitting inside a high-rise luxury condominium located directly in the center of the downtown financial district. The property records confirmed that the extravagant penthouse had been leased just 6 months ago. Gavin was using the money he had stolen from my daughter to fund his mistress's lavish lifestyle in one of the most expensive zip codes in the entire city. The enemy was isolated, comfortable, and completely unaware that we had just acquired her exact coordinates. I closed the digital map and secured the tactical laptop inside my leather briefcase. I looked at Thomas, confirming that we had enough actionable intelligence to execute the next phase of the operation. I instructed Olivia to remain inside the secure perimeter of the Grand Monarch Hotel penthouse. I assured her that the building security was on high alert and that no one associated with Jonathan or Gavin could possibly reach her. She nodded, understanding that this specific mission required the cold, intimidating presence of a military commander, not the emotional involvement of a betrayed wife. I buttoned my tailored charcoal suit jacket, checked the gold tie clip holding my collar in place, and walked toward the heavy double doors of the suite. Thomas meticulously packed the forged international passport, the unlocked burner phone, and a thick stack of freshly printed copies featuring the most damning text messages into a classified federal evidence folder. We moved with absolute, silent efficiency. We rode the private VIP elevator down to the subterranean parking garage and climbed into a heavily tinted black utility vehicle. The city streets were completely deserted as we navigated through the freezing winter night. We drove swiftly toward the towering glass structure of Valerie's luxury downtown building. The darkness outside mirrored the absolute uncompromising resolve I carried in my chest. We parked the vehicle quietly in the shadows across the street from the opulent entrance of the condominium. I looked up at the illuminated windows near the top floor. Valerie thought she was untouchable, safely hidden away in a fortress built on stolen money. She was about to receive a very harsh education in the consequences of crossing my family. Thomas and I stepped out into the biting winter wind, determined to confront the mistress face to face. We were going to shatter her arrogant illusion, rip away her financial safety net, and violently flip her testimony to completely annihilate Gavin's final defense strategy. We bypassed the drowsy lobby concierge with a simple flash of Thomas's federal credentials and rode the glass elevator directly to the top floor. The corridor was silent, lined with expensive modern art that Gavin had undoubtedly paid for using my daughter's stolen savings. I stepped up to the heavy mahogany door of Valerie's penthouse and knocked with 3 sharp, commanding strikes. A moment later, the door swung open. Valerie stood framed in the warm light of the entryway, wearing a silk robe and holding a glass of expensive champagne. She possessed the manufactured confidence of a woman who believed her beauty made her untouchable. Her arrogant smile faltered for a fraction of a second when she saw 2 imposing men instead of her lover, but she quickly recovered her composure. She leaned against the doorframe, completely dismissing my authority, and haughtily asked what business a broke old man had interrupting her evening. She assumed I was there to beg for my daughter's money back. Valerie took a slow sip of her champagne and boldly attempted to extort me right there in the hallway. She smirked and stated that if I wanted her to keep the stolen funds hidden from the federal investigators currently tearing apart Gavin's life, it would cost me exactly $1 million in untraceable cash. She truly believed she held all the leverage, thinking she was the mastermind of a flawless escape plan. I did not entertain her pathetic attempt at negotiation. I simply pushed past her, stepping directly into the lavish living room without asking for permission. Thomas followed closely behind me, securing the heavy door and locking the deadbolt with a resounding click that echoed through the quiet apartment. I walked over to the sprawling glass coffee table and opened my leather briefcase. I did not raise my voice, nor did I show a single ounce of anger. I coldly withdrew a thick stack of official Internal Revenue Service documents and spread them out across the glass surface. I ordered Valerie to look very closely at the highlighted signature lines. Gavin had indeed set up a massive network of illicit shell companies to launder the stolen equity from my trust, but he was far more cowardly than she realized. He had not registered a single one of those fraudulent corporations under his own name. He had registered every single entity entirely under Valerie's social security number. She stared down at the documents, her champagne glass trembling, as the horrific reality of her situation began to dawn on her. I explained the federal statutes with chilling, calculated precision. If Gavin went down for wire fraud and grand larceny, she would not be viewed as an innocent bystander. The federal government would explicitly prosecute her as the primary accomplice and the central architect of the money laundering operation. I told her that the mandatory minimum sentence for the volume of federal tax evasion she was currently responsible for was 20 years in a maximum security prison. I made it absolutely clear that Gavin was planning to abandon her the exact same way he had abandoned my daughter. Valerie's arrogant facade shattered instantly into a million pieces. The expensive silk robe and the vintage champagne suddenly offered absolutely no protection against the crushing, imminent weight of federal prosecution. Her breathing became shallow and erratic as she dropped the crystal glass onto the coffee table, completely paralyzed by the terrifying prospect of spending the best decades of her life inside a cold concrete cell. Panic entirely consumed her previous bravado. She looked wildly between Thomas and me, frantically asking how she could avoid federal prison and pleading for a way out of the devastating trap her lover had locked her into. I told her that the only currency I accepted was absolute, unconditional cooperation. I demanded the immediate surrender of Gavin's primary operational hardware. Valerie did not hesitate for a single second to save her own skin. She practically sprinted across the expansive living room and tore open a hidden magnetic compartment built into the base of her custom entertainment center. She pulled out a sleek, heavy laptop and handed it directly to Thomas with violently shaking hands. She rapidly confessed that the device was Gavin's heavily encrypted master terminal. She admitted that it contained the complete, unredacted digital footprint of the Stanford family's entire money laundering operation, including Jonathan's illicit corporate logistics ledgers and the offshore routing numbers meant for their Caribbean escape. She wept, openly swearing she would testify against Gavin Jonathan, or anyone else we needed her to, as long as I promised to protect her from the federal prosecutors. She had flipped her loyalty in less than 5 minutes, proving that thieves possess absolutely no honor when faced with their own total annihilation. I instructed Thomas to secure the master terminal inside his reinforced evidence case. I looked down at the weeping, terrified woman kneeling on the expensive rug and offered her a final piece of tactical advice. I told her to pack a bag, leave the city immediately, and wait for my legal team to contact her for her official deposition. I promised her that if she attempted to contact Gavin or Jonathan to warn them of our strike, I would personally ensure the IRS received every single document I had laid on her table. I gathered my briefcase, turned my back on the broken mistress, and walked out of the luxury penthouse. We descended to the quiet street and drove back to our secured command post at the Grand Monarch Hotel, holding the absolute key to Jonathan's corporate destruction right in our hands. The intelligence we had just acquired was lethal enough to dismantle their entire logistical empire by sunrise. But while we were securing the digital weapon, the enemy was actively realizing their vulnerability. Across town, inside the sprawling Stanford estate, Jonathan had managed to bypass the police tape sealing his son's home office. He was desperately searching for the master laptop to purge the damning financial records before federal investigators could secure a search warrant. When he discovered the hidden compartment was completely empty, his panic morphed into a ruthless, violent desperation. Jonathan realized the broke old man he had mocked at Christmas dinner was systematically dismantling his life. Driven by absolute terror and vast wealth, he bypassed the law entirely. Jonathan contacted a highly classified underworld fixer and hired a crew of private, heavily armed mercenaries. He ordered them to launch an immediate deadly raid on my hotel penthouse to retrieve the master terminal at any cost. The digital clock on the bedside table shifted to 2 in the morning. Outside the expansive floor-to-ceiling windows of the Grand Monarch Hotel, the city was completely silent, buried under a fresh layer of freezing winter snow. Inside the penthouse, the atmosphere was thick with impending conflict. Down in the lobby, 3 heavily armed private mercenaries bypassed the overnight security desk with practiced ease. Jonathan had undoubtedly paid top dollar for their services, hiring professionals who specialized in corporate espionage and violent asset retrieval. They wore dark tactical gear, their faces obscured by black masks moving with the synchronized fluidity of men accustomed to operating outside the boundaries of the law. They rode the maintenance elevator directly to the top floor, entirely avoiding the security cameras installed in the main corridors. They approached the heavy double doors of my suite, moving with absolute confidence. The lead operative pulled out a sophisticated electronic lock-picking device, bypassing the electronic deadbolt in a matter of seconds. The heavy door clicked open with a barely audible mechanical snap. They slipped into the dark entryway, their weapons drawn and suppressed. They expected this operation to be a simple, routine extraction. They believed they were raiding the hotel room of a sleeping, defenseless elderly civilian who had stumbled into a corporate conspiracy. They assumed the broke old man would surrender the encrypted master laptop the moment they pointed a weapon at his head. They were profoundly mistaken. I was not asleep. 4 decades of military service across hostile global combat zones permanently alters a man's internal warning system. I had anticipated Jonathan's desperate retaliation the exact moment Thomas secured Gavin's encrypted laptop. I was standing perfectly still in the deep shadows of the main living area, dressed in dark clothing completely blending into the pitch-black surroundings of the penthouse. I regulated my breathing, lowering my heart rate to a steady operational calm. The 3 mercenaries moved systematically into the room, their boots making no sound against the thick luxury carpets. The lead operative signaled his men to fan out and search the primary bedroom. They made the fatal error of splitting their formation in an unsecured, hostile environment. As the first man walked past the heavy marble dining table, I stepped out from the blind spot directly behind him. I did not give him a fraction of a second to react or raise his suppressed weapon. Utilizing absolute tactical precision, I executed a brutal close-quarters takedown. I grabbed his weapon hand, twisted it sharply outward to shatter his grip, and used his own forward momentum to drive his skull violently into the solid marble edge of the table. He collapsed instantly without making a single sound. The second operative spun around, his eyes widening in panic as he registered his fallen leader. Before he could squeeze his trigger, I closed the distance. I swept his legs out from under him and delivered a precise, incapacitating strike to the side of his neck. He hit the floor unconscious. The third man lunged at me in pure desperation, swinging a tactical combat knife. I sidestepped the wild thrust, clamped my hands onto his extended arm, and leveraged his entire body weight over my shoulder, slamming him brutally onto the hardwood floor. The fight was completely over in less than 15 seconds. I had neutralized all 3 professional mercenaries without firing a single shot. The expansive luxury suite fell completely silent once again, save for the ragged, unconscious breathing of the neutralized intruders lying scattered across the floor. I did not waste a single moment admiring the swiftness of my victory. I immediately secured the perimeter, checking the hallway to ensure they had not brought a secondary backup team. Satisfied the immediate threat was contained, I walked over to my tactical overnight bag, and pulled out a handful of heavy-duty military-grade zip ties. I moved methodically from man to man, binding their wrists and ankles tightly behind their backs, rendering them completely immobile for when they eventually regained consciousness. I systematically stripped them of their suppressed firearms, tactical knives, and communication devices, piling the weapons safely out of their reach on the dining table. With the physical threat entirely dismantled, I crouched down beside the team leader. I patted down his tactical vest and extracted a heavily encrypted burner phone from his interior pocket. I handed the device directly to Thomas, who had remained safely secured in the adjoining suite during the brief physical altercation. Thomas immediately connected the mercenary phone to his decryption terminal. Within minutes, he shattered the security firewall. The digital logs illuminated the screen, exposing the undeniable financial blueprint of the midnight raid. The messages revealed direct, unmistakable payment authorizations linking the mercenary strike team straight back to Jonathan's private corporate accounts. The wealthy businessman had authorized a massive offshore wire transfer just hours earlier, offering a brutal bonus if the men managed to permanently silence the target. Jonathan had crossed the line from financial fraud to premeditated attempted murder. I stood over the bound, unconscious mercenaries scattered across the pristine carpet of the luxury penthouse. The sheer arrogance of Jonathan's strategy was staggering. He truly believed his massive wealth allowed him to operate entirely above the law, purchasing human lives to clean up the catastrophic mess his son had created. He thought he could order a violent raid on a retired four-star general and face absolutely zero consequences. I pulled my secure encrypted phone from my pocket and opened the high-definition camera. I framed the shot with cold, calculated intention. I captured a stark, terrifying photograph of his expensive, heavily armed strike team lying completely neutralized and bound on the floor of my suite. The image was a brutal, undeniable testament to the total failure of his violent retaliation. I opened a direct encrypted messaging channel to Jonathan's personal, unlisted cell phone number, a contact Thomas had extracted from Gavin Master laptop earlier that evening. I attached the high-resolution photograph of his defeated mercenaries. I did not type out a long, dramatic threat or demand his immediate surrender. A seasoned commander knows that psychological terror is far more effective when it is delivered with absolute minimalist precision. I typed exactly 2 words into the text field: "Your move." I hit send and watched the delivery confirmation flash green on my screen. I knew Jonathan was sitting awake in his sprawling mansion across town, desperately waiting for a confirmation call from his strike team. Instead, he was about to receive undeniable visual proof that his entire world was crashing down around him. The financial war had escalated into a physical battle, and he had just lost his best soldiers. The arrogant corporate predator who had tried to throw me into a nursing home was completely out of options. The hunter had officially become the hunted. Jonathan's world shattered the exact moment my message illuminated his phone screen. He had spent decades believing his immense wealth provided an impenetrable shield against consequences, confident that a thick checkbook could erase any problem. He stared at the high-resolution photograph of his elite, heavily armed mercenary team lying completely neutralized and bound on my hotel floor. The absolute failure of his violent raid sent him spiraling into an unhinged, frantic panic. The arrogant corporate predator finally understood he was hopelessly outmatched. He realized with terrifying clarity that hiring street thugs and private military contractors was a catastrophic miscalculation against a retired 4-star general who had spent a lifetime commanding actual warfare. Jonathan paced his sprawling mansion, his mind frantically searching for a defensive strategy, but he was entirely blind to the fact that my true offensive had not even begun. While he was desperately trying to secure his physical safety, I launched a devastating targeted strike against his center of gravity. I completely bypassed his personal accounts and aimed directly at his primary source of power, his massive, lucrative logistics corporation. His entire empire was built on a foundation of highly classified, extremely profitable supply contracts with the United States Department of Defense. It was a tactical vulnerability I was uniquely positioned to exploit. I did not need a team of lawyers to dismantle his company. I picked up my secure encrypted phone and placed a single highly classified call directly to my long-standing contacts at the Pentagon. I bypassed the standard bureaucratic channels and connected immediately with the Inspector General for the Department of Defense. I transmitted the raw, unredacted data we had extracted from Gavin's master laptop. The encrypted files provided absolute, undeniable proof that Jonathan's logistics company was heavily engaged in defrauding federal government contracts, artificially inflating shipping costs, and utilizing military supply routes to launder millions in illicit funds. The evidence was pristine, meticulously documented by Gavin's own careless record-keeping. I outlined the exact corporate shell structures and highlighted the specific offshore routing numbers Jonathan used to hide the stolen taxpayer money. The Inspector General did not hesitate. The combination of my flawless military reputation and the sheer volume of concrete financial evidence triggered an immediate, overwhelming federal response. Jonathan had weaponized his corporate influence to terrorize my family, and I was using the full, uncompromising weight of the United States government to completely eradicate his empire. Less than 3 hours after my phone call, the devastating consequences of Jonathan's greed materialized. A massive fleet of unmarked black federal vehicles and tactical transport vans descended simultaneously upon every single one of Jonathan's commercial warehouses across the state. Hundreds of federal auditors, heavily armed FBI agents, and military investigators stormed the facilities. They moved with absolute coordinated precision, completely shutting down the logistics network in a matter of minutes. The federal agents immediately froze all corporate assets, locking down every bank account associated with the enterprise. They physically seized the shipping manifests, confiscated the hard drives, and chained the massive loading docks shut, halting millions of dollars in inventory. Jonathan's arrogant executives watched in absolute horror as federal warrants were plastered across the glass doors of their headquarters. The news of the massive federal raid spread through the corporate sector like wildfire. The moment the severe, catastrophic nature of the federal fraud charges became public, Jonathan's meticulously assembled board of directors panicked. Driven entirely by self-preservation, every single board member submitted their immediate unconditional resignation. They completely severed all ties with the toxic CEO, publicly distancing themselves from the colossal scandal and abandoning Jonathan to face the devastating federal fallout entirely alone. Jonathan watched his multi-million-dollar empire evaporate into dust in a single brutal afternoon. His phone lines were dead, his assets were entirely frozen, and his political allies had completely abandoned him. He was completely stripped of his power, reduced to a desperate cornered man facing decades in a federal penitentiary. The crushing weight of absolute ruin shattered his remaining composure. He knew the FBI possessed undeniable proof of his vast money laundering operations, and he understood that the federal prosecutors would not offer him a single shred of leniency. Driven by pure, unadulterated cowardice and a frantic need to save his own skin at any cost, Jonathan made a horrifying, calculated decision. He bypassed his team of panicked defense attorneys and drove his vehicle directly to the heavily fortified county jail. He arranged an emergency, unrecorded visitation with his incarcerated son. He walked into the bleak, fluorescent-lit visitor room with a single, ruthless objective. He was going to demand that Gavin sign a full, legally binding confession, taking the absolute entire fall for the massive corporate fraud to protect Jonathan's freedom and the remaining fragments of their family name. The sterile, fluorescent-lit visitor room of the county jail provided a stark contrast to the opulent mahogany dining rooms where Jonathan usually conducted his business. Through the extensive federal surveillance network and the recorded jailhouse lines, Thomas and I monitored every single second of the catastrophic family fallout. Jonathan sat across from his son at a bolted steel table. The environment was entirely devoid of any parental warmth or basic human empathy. Jonathan did not ask Gavin how he was holding up in federal custody. He did not offer words of comfort or promise to hire the best defense attorneys in the country. Instead, the wealthy businessman treated his own flesh and blood like a failing corporate asset that needed to be aggressively liquidated. Jonathan reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a heavily redacted legal document prepared by his crisis management team. With cold, calculated precision, Jonathan slid the printed confession directly across the cold metal table. The motion was an exact, chilling replica of the way he had slid that insulting nursing home brochure across the table to me on Christmas Eve. Jonathan explicitly demanded that Gavin sign the sworn affidavit right then and there. The document stated that Gavin took absolute sole responsibility for the creation of the illicit shell companies and the massive money laundering operation. Jonathan told his son that the family name had to be protected at all costs. He was actively demanding that his child absorb the entire weight of a multi-decade federal prison sentence, effectively sacrificing the son to secure the absolute freedom of the father. Gavin stared down at the printed confession, his hands shaking slightly against the metal table. In that stark, unforgiving moment, the arrogant boy finally realized that his familial bond was entirely transactional. His father did not view him as a son to be protected, but as a convenient scapegoat to be discarded the moment he became a legal liability. Gavin looked up into Jonathan's cold, impatient eyes and recognized the exact same predatory cruelty they had both attempted to use against me. He was being systematically thrown away, ordered to sacrifice his entire future so an older man could maintain his comfortable, wealthy lifestyle. The profound irony of the situation crashed down upon him. He had spent months manipulating my daughter and plotting to steal my $12 million trust to impress a father who was now asking him to die in a concrete cage. A deep, bitter resentment flooded Gavin's chest. The toxic loyalty he had harbored for his family completely evaporated, replaced by a pure, unadulterated need for vengeance against the man who had just betrayed him. Gavin realized that the Stanford legacy was nothing more than a hollow shell built on mutual exploitation. Gavin did not pick up the pen provided by his father. He placed his hands flat on the table, pushed his chair back, and flatly refused to sign the confession. He told Jonathan that he would not spend the best years of his life rotting in a federal penitentiary while the true architect of the fraud sat comfortably in a mansion sipping expensive bourbon. Gavin stood up, signaling the guards that the visitation was officially over. He left his father sitting alone at the metal table, completely shattering their criminal alliance as he walked back to his holding cell, fueled entirely by spite. As soon as Jonathan was escorted out of the county jail facility, Gavin demanded to use his single legally mandated phone call. He did not call his expensive corporate defense attorneys, and he certainly did not try to call my daughter. Driven entirely by sheer malicious spite against his own father, Gavin dialed the direct cellular number for Thomas. Back in our secured penthouse command center, Thomas put the incoming jailhouse call on speakerphone so I could monitor the intelligence in real time. Gavin's voice came through the line, sounding exhausted but fueled by a frantic, destructive energy. He stated immediately that he knew his life was effectively over, but he was absolutely determined to ensure his father went down with him. Gavin offered a highly lucrative tactical trade. He told Thomas that Jonathan had successfully hidden tens of millions of dollars in untraceable offshore accounts, completely separate from the logistics company that the federal agents had already seized. These hidden accounts contained the true bulk of the Stanford family fortune, shielded behind complex layers of international bank secrecy laws. Gavin revealed that he possessed the master decryption keys and the exact routing numbers required to access every single one of those hidden offshore vaults. He offered to hand over the complete digital roadmap to Jonathan's hidden wealth. In exchange, Gavin demanded that Thomas use his leverage with the federal prosecutors to secure a heavily reduced prison sentence and absolute federal immunity regarding the broader corporate conspiracy charges. It was the ultimate act of familial betrayal executed with the exact same ruthless calculation his father had just demonstrated. Gavin was willing to burn his father's entire hidden empire to the ground simply to guarantee they shared the exact same miserable fate. Thomas did not hesitate for a single second. Acting with my direct authorization, my legal counsel formally accepted the deal over the recorded line. He guaranteed Gavin that the federal prosecutors would honor the substantial sentence reduction in exchange for the immediate surrender of the decryption keys. Gavin rattled off the complex alphanumeric codes and the specific overseas banking destinations, permanently securing the final inescapable nail in Jonathan's coffin. We immediately forwarded the fresh intelligence to the federal investigators, who began locking down the offshore accounts within minutes. However, the Stanford family had spent decades cultivating a vast network of corrupt local officials. A compromised guard working inside the county jail had monitored Gavin's explosive phone call. Seeking a final lucrative payout, the corrupt guard used a smuggled burner phone to contact Jonathan directly. The guard tipped the wealthy businessman off about his son's devastating betrayal, warning Jonathan that federal marshals were currently securing warrants for his immediate arrest based on the new offshore evidence. Jonathan received the call inside his sprawling mansion and spiraled into absolute terror. Realizing his massive legal shield had completely collapsed and that heavily armed federal agents were minutes away from kicking down his front door, Jonathan made a desperate final play. He rushed to his hidden wall safe, frantically liquidating his remaining physical cash and scooping up a handful of high-value conflict diamonds he kept for emergencies. He threw the untraceable assets into a leather duffel bag, abandoned his wife without a single word of warning, and sped off into the freezing night. He was heading straight for a private, unregulated airfield on the outskirts of the city, absolutely determined to board an untracked charter flight and flee the country before the federal net closed around him. The twin engines of the sleek private jet whined with a deafening, high-pitched roar across the dark, rain-slicked tarmac. The unregulated private airfield on the desolate outskirts of the city offered zero commercial oversight, making it the absolute perfect escape route for a desperate, wealthy fugitive. Jonathan sprinted across the wet asphalt, his expensive leather shoes slipping against the freezing rain as the storm intensified. He clutched a heavy titanium briefcase tightly against his chest like a physical shield. Inside that reinforced metal shell rested millions of dollars in liquidated cash, untraceable bearer bonds, and a velvet pouch filled with high-value conflict diamonds he had hoarded for exactly this type of catastrophic emergency. He reached the bottom of the aluminum boarding stairs and paused to catch his breath. The disgraced businessman looked back over his shoulder at the empty access road, a triumphant, arrogant smirk twisting his rain-soaked face. He truly believed he had successfully outsmarted the federal government and completely evaded my tactical net. He assumed his deep pockets and quick reflexes had guaranteed his absolute freedom, leaving his own son to rot in a county jail, and his wife Patricia to face the media fallout entirely alone. He tightened his grip on the titanium handle and took his first eager step up toward the illuminated cabin of the aircraft. He was utterly convinced that his vast hidden wealth had saved his skin one final time. His delusion of absolute victory was instantly pulverized. Without a single warning siren to announce their arrival, a massive fleet of unmarked black federal utility vehicles surged from the pitch-black perimeter of the remote airfield. They accelerated onto the active runway with terrifying synchronized speed, their heavy all-terrain tires screeching violently against the wet asphalt. The lead vehicles aggressively boxed in the private jet, forming an impenetrable steel barricade that physically cut off its taxi path and completely blocked the pilot from initiating a takeoff sequence. A dozen blinding white tactical floodlights snapped on simultaneously from the roofs of the SUVs. The brilliant beams pierced the dark winter night, pinning Jonathan perfectly in their harsh, unforgiving glare. He froze midway up the boarding stairs, throwing his free arm up to shield his eyes from the overwhelming illumination. The heavy armored doors of the lead vehicle swung open in perfect unison. I stepped out into the freezing, relentless rain. I did not wear the bespoke charcoal suit from the bank confrontation. I was wearing the faded olive-drab military overcoat, the exact same garment Jonathan had mocked at his opulent Christmas dinner table. I walked forward with measured, undeniable authority, my heavy boots splashing loudly against the flooded tarmac. I stopped right at the base of the boarding stairs, placing myself immovably between the disgraced corporate predator and his multi-million-dollar escape route. I stared up at him through the blinding tactical lights, projecting the absolute unshakable presence of a commanding general who had successfully cornered his primary target. Jonathan descended into a state of sheer, unadulterated hysteria. He screamed desperate, empty threats over the deafening whine of the jet engines, frantically commanding his hired pilots to ignore the federal blockade and force the aircraft into the sky. He waved his free hand wildly, shouting that he possessed enough money inside his titanium briefcase to buy the loyalty of every single federal agent currently standing on the runway. I did not raise my voice, nor did I react to his pathetic, thrashing panic. I simply looked directly into his terrified eyes and began to calmly recite a long, highly complex sequence of numbers. I listed the exact global coordinates, the specific encrypted SWIFT codes, and the hidden routing numbers of his primary offshore banking vaults located in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland. Jonathan abruptly stopped screaming. The color drained entirely from his rain-slicked face as the horrific reality of my words paralyzed his vocal cords. I informed him that Gavin had eagerly surrendered the master decryption keys to my legal counsel just hours ago in exchange for federal immunity. I confirmed with absolute chilling precision that federal authorities had already breached the firewalls and seized every single penny of his hidden international fortune. He was completely irrevocably bankrupt. I pointed a steady finger at the heavy titanium briefcase clutched in his trembling hands. I told him that the metal box he was holding was no longer his emergency travel fund. It was literally all the wealth he had left in the entire world, and he was about to surrender it directly to the United States government. The side doors of the surrounding utility vehicles opened in perfect synchronization. A squad of heavily armed federal marshals stepped out onto the rain-soaked runway, their dark tactical gear shedding the heavy downpour. They moved with absolute uncompromising efficiency, rapidly surrounding the base of the boarding stairs and completely cutting off any remaining avenue of retreat. Two senior marshals marched directly up the aluminum steps, grabbing Jonathan forcefully by the shoulders before he could even attempt to run. They ripped the heavy titanium briefcase from his paralyzed grip and slammed him aggressively against the side fuselage of his own private jet. The sharp, unmistakable sound of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around his wrists cut sharply through the chaotic noise of the airfield. The lead marshal leaned in close, reading Jonathan his Miranda rights in a loud, commanding voice that easily competed with the dying roar of the jet engines shutting down. The wealthy corporate titan who had built an entire empire on fraud, intimidation, and manipulation was physically dragged down the stairs and shoved violently into the back of a waiting federal transport vehicle. I stood silently in the freezing rain, watching the red taillights of the transport van fade into the dark winter night. The tactical field operation was a complete, undeniable success. The Stanford men were now both entirely incarcerated, stripped of their stolen wealth, and locked securely inside federal holding cells. The physical pursuit had officially concluded, but the war was not completely over. With the criminals securely behind bars, the battlefield now shifted away from the shadows and directly into the unforgiving light of the public justice system. The final arena awaited us, setting the stage for the ultimate courtroom showdown. With Jonathan and Gavin securely locked inside federal holding cells, the battlefield momentarily shifted from the shadows of the rain-slicked tarmac to the glaring, unforgiving spotlight of the local media. Patricia, Jonathan's wife, and the deeply proud matriarch of their crumbling high society empire, launched a desperate, heavily funded public relations campaign. She adamantly refused to accept the catastrophic reality of her family's complete financial and legal annihilation. Instead of maintaining a dignified silence, she hired an expensive crisis management firm and booked primetime interviews on every major regional news broadcast. She sat perfectly composed in front of the television cameras, wearing understated designer clothing and deliberately wiping away expertly manufactured crocodile tears. Patricia attempted to completely rewrite the narrative of the past week. She blatantly ignored the massive mountain of federal evidence, the seized offshore accounts, and the forged financial documents. Instead, she painted a pathetic, entirely fabricated picture of a wealthy but innocent family being systematically destroyed by a vindictive, deranged old man. She looked directly into the camera lenses and spun a tragic tale, claiming I was suffering from severe, untreated cognitive decline and had manipulated the federal authorities out of sheer, misplaced malice. She portrayed her husband and her son as devoted businessmen who had simply tried to help an aging, confused father-in-law manage his chaotic estate. She banked entirely on her affluent social standing, hoping the public would automatically sympathize with a weeping wealthy socialite, rather than question the hard, undeniable facts of the federal indictments. Her arrogance was truly boundless, assuming she could manipulate public opinion just as easily as her husband had manipulated his corporate ledgers. I absolutely refused to retaliate in the media. A seasoned military commander does not waste valuable ammunition engaging in petty emotional shouting matches on local television. While Patricia was busy performing for the cameras and attempting to garner unearned sympathy from her country club friends, I focused my attention entirely on the airtight legal documentation secured within my trust portfolio. Thomas and I sat in the quiet command center of the Grand Monarch Hotel penthouse, meticulously reviewing the intricate financial web Jonathan had woven over the past decade. The arrogant businessman had been incredibly reckless in his desperation to keep his fraudulent logistics empire afloat. We discovered that Jonathan had used the sprawling multi-million-dollar mansion he shared with Patricia as direct collateral to secure several massive, highly illicit corporate bridge loans. Those specific loans had been quietly purchased and absorbed by my own commercial holding company months ago as part of my diversified investment strategy. By defaulting on his obligations and triggering a total federal asset freeze, Jonathan had legally forfeited his primary residence directly to me. I instructed Thomas to bypass any standard grace periods and immediately file the necessary paperwork to execute a total, uncompromising foreclosure on the estate. I did not send the eviction notice quietly through the mail. I ordered a team of process servers accompanied by local law enforcement to deliver the foreclosure documents straight to the mansion's massive iron gates during broad daylight. The eviction notice was served publicly, completely shattering Patricia's carefully constructed media narrative in front of her affluent neighbors. The same woman who had coldly smiled while her husband handed me a brochure for a low-income nursing home was now legally mandated to vacate her sprawling estate within 72 hours. Her wealth, her status, and her pristine reputation were systematically dismantled by the exact same ruthless financial mechanisms her family had attempted to use against me. The sheer overwhelming reality of her immediate homelessness completely broke Patricia's manufactured media facade. Less than 4 hours after the public eviction notice was plastered across her custom mahogany front doors, she bypassed hotel security and arrived unannounced at the private executive office I had established downtown. The impeccably groomed socialite who had wept crocodile tears on television was completely gone. She burst into my office looking thoroughly disheveled, her expensive makeup ruined by genuine frantic tears. She collapsed into the guest chair across from my desk, sobbing uncontrollably and begging me for mercy. She pleaded with me to halt the foreclosure, frantically claiming that losing the mansion would permanently destroy her standing in high society and leave her with absolutely nothing. She desperately tried to distance herself from the criminal actions of her husband and her son, swearing she had no actual knowledge of the forged documents or the offshore money laundering operations. I sat perfectly still in my leather chair, watching her unravel with absolute chilling detachment. I coldly reminded her of the opulent Christmas dinner. I recounted her forced patronizing politeness, her thinly veiled disgust for my faded military coat, and her absolute silent complicity when her husband slid that insulting envelope across the dining table. She had sat there drinking imported wine, fully supporting the plan to throw me into a sterile facility simply to clear space for her son's fraudulent tech startup. I told her that she did not object to the cruelty when it benefited her luxurious lifestyle, and I would offer her absolutely no mercy now that the consequences had finally arrived at her own doorstep. I instructed my security personnel to escort her out of the building, leaving her to face the brutal reality of her new impoverished existence entirely alone. The months leading up to the trial were a masterclass in federal preparation. The prosecution built an impenetrable fortress of evidence, utilizing the encrypted offshore routing numbers, the signed confession from the corrupt psychiatrist, and the exhaustive digital footprint extracted directly from Gavin's master laptop. Every desperate legal maneuver attempted by their high-priced defense attorneys was systematically crushed before it could even reach the judge's desk. The Stanford family's vast empire had been completely liquidated, their assets seized by the government to pay back the massive mountains of stolen taxpayer funds and defrauded investors. The day the trial finally commenced, the heavy winter snow had melted, giving way to a crisp, unforgiving spring morning. I walked into the downtown federal courthouse wearing my tailored charcoal suit, projecting the unwavering authority of a man who had successfully defended his family against absolute ruin. The sprawling courtroom was packed to absolute maximum capacity. Dozens of eager reporters, curious local citizens, and former business associates filled the wooden pews, creating a suffocating atmosphere of intense anticipation. The heavy oak doors at the front of the room swung open with a loud, echoing crack. A detail of armed federal marshals marched Gavin and Jonathan directly into the courtroom. The two men were dressed in identical bright orange prison jumpsuits, their wrists and ankles bound in heavy steel chains. They were directed to the defense table, but they absolutely refused to acknowledge each other. The father and son were forced to sit at completely opposite ends of the long wooden table. They did not project the unified front of a wealthy, powerful family fighting for their freedom. Instead, they spent the entire proceeding glaring at each other across the polished wood, their eyes burning with a pure, unadulterated hatred that promised absolute mutual destruction. The trial officially commenced under the harsh fluorescent lights of the federal courthouse. I sat directly behind the prosecution table, maintaining the rigid, uncompromising posture of a military commander surveying an active battlefield. Across the wide center aisle, Gavin and Jonathan sat flanked by a small army of highly expensive corporate defense attorneys. The lead defense counsel stood up to deliver his opening statement, projecting a smooth, heavily manufactured confidence. He immediately attempted to weave a complex narrative of familial confusion and generational misunderstanding. He painted Gavin as an ambitious, eager entrepreneur who had simply made a few misguided, desperate administrative errors to keep his technology startup afloat. The attorney then aggressively shifted his focus to Jonathan, portraying the wealthy logistics CEO as an innocent, deeply concerned father who was merely trying to protect his son from a vindictive, controlling father-in-law. The core of their entire legal strategy rested heavily on character assassination. The defense attorney pointed a polished finger in my direction and brazenly argued that my advanced age of 70 years made me an entirely unreliable witness. He suggested to the jury that my perception of reality was severely clouded by personal grievance and early cognitive decline. He attempted to convince the courtroom that I had orchestrated a massive federal witch hunt simply because I disapproved of my daughter's marriage. It was a predictable, desperate tactical maneuver designed to exploit societal biases against senior citizens. I did not flinch or break eye contact with the jury. I had faced hostile interrogations in active global war zones, and I was not about to let a slick corporate lawyer intimidate me in a civilian courtroom. The defense was building a fragile house of cards on a foundation of ageism and assumed vulnerability, completely unaware of the devastating counterattack about to hit them. The prosecution did not waste a single moment indulging the defense's fabricated storyline. The lead federal prosecutor stood up and immediately called Dr. Hoffman to the witness stand. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and the disgraced private psychiatrist walked slowly down the center aisle. He looked absolutely terrified, his expensive designer suit hanging loosely on his frame. He took the oath with a visibly trembling raised hand and sat down in the witness box. The prosecutor did not offer him any gentle introductions. He immediately presented the certified offshore banking records and the signed sealed legal affidavit we had secured at his clinic months ago. Under the crushing threat of a maximum security federal prison sentence, the heavily sweating psychiatrist completely broke down on the stand. He publicly admitted to accepting a $50,000 illegal wire transfer directly from Jonathan's corporate shell accounts. Hoffman stated clearly into the courtroom microphone that the massive payment was an explicit, premeditated bribe. He detailed the exact ruthless instructions he had received directly from the wealthy businessman. Jonathan had explicitly ordered him to falsely diagnose me with severe paranoia and aggressive violent dementia, regardless of my actual cognitive health or the results of the evaluation. Hoffman confessed that the entire medical examination was a complete sham specifically engineered to establish an emergency legal guardianship. He admitted the ultimate goal was to strip me of my constitutional rights, forcibly lock me inside a secure psychiatric facility, and hand Jonathan absolute, uncontested control over my $12 million military trust portfolio. The doctor wiped his brow with a trembling hand, looking like a man who had sold his soul and was currently paying the ultimate price. He admitted that Jonathan had guaranteed him absolute legal protection, a promise that now proved entirely worthless against the full weight of a federal indictment. The defense team's entire carefully constructed narrative of innocence and familial concern crumbled instantly into a pile of worthless dust. The sheer, undeniable weight of a board-certified medical professional publicly confessing to bribery and judicial subversion echoed through the silent courtroom. I watched the faces of the 12 jurors sitting in the box. Their initial expressions of neutral, polite observation shifted rapidly to absolute, unadulterated disgust. They stared at Jonathan not as a respectable community business leader, but as a cold, calculating predator who was willing to medically imprison his own family member for financial gain. The highly paid defense attorneys scrambled frantically, whispering aggressively to one another and furiously shuffling through their legal pads in a desperate attempt to formulate a viable cross-examination strategy. They quickly realized there was absolutely no way to legally dismantle a sworn confession backed by international bank routing numbers. Jonathan slumped heavily in his wooden chair. The arrogant, untouchable posture he had maintained since the Christmas dinner completely evaporated. He stared blankly at the polished table, the color draining entirely from his face as the horrific reality of his situation finally breached his massive ego. He realized that his bottomless checkbook and his deep political connections could not save him from his own meticulously documented corruption. The federal net we had quietly woven around his life was now tightening with lethal, inescapable force right in front of the public gallery. The wealthy corporate titan was officially drowning in his own greed. Beside him, Gavin looked equally shattered. The son who had tried to steal my daughter's future was now realizing that his father's powerful shield was entirely broken. The entire Stanford dynasty was collapsing under the bright lights of the justice system, and I watched the demolition with absolute unwavering satisfaction. The shocking nature of the psychiatric confession sent a massive wave of chaotic murmurs rippling through the crowded public gallery. Reporters frantically typed on their devices, and spectators exchanged horrified whispers. The presiding federal judge immediately slammed his heavy wooden gavel against the sounding block, the sharp cracks cutting through the rising noise. He sternly demanded absolute order in his courtroom, threatening to clear the entire gallery if the spectators could not maintain proper decorum. The room fell back into a tense, suffocating silence. The defense attorney slowly stood up, looking completely defeated, and officially declined to cross-examine Dr. Hoffman. He knew that asking a single question would only allow the prosecution to hammer the bribery evidence deeper into the jury's minds. Hoffman was swiftly excused from the stand, practically running out of the courtroom to escape the glaring eyes of the public. The lead federal prosecutor straightened his suit jacket and turned back toward the judge. He confidently announced that the state was ready to call its next star witness to the stand. The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open once again. Every single head in the room turned to watch as Valerie strutted deliberately down the center aisle. Gavin's former mistress wore a sharp conservative business suit projecting the absolute confidence of a woman who had successfully secured federal immunity. Clutched tightly under her right arm was the heavy, encrypted master laptop that contained the Stanford family's entire digital criminal footprint. She walked straight past the defense table without a single glance at her former lover, entirely ready to deliver the testimony that would permanently annihilate Gavin. She carried herself not as a defeated accomplice, but as the prosecution's ultimate weapon. Gavin gripped the edge of the defense table, his knuckles turning white as he stared at the woman he had planned to flee to the Cayman Islands with. The trap was perfectly set, and the final execution was about to begin. Valerie stepped into the witness box and raised her right hand to take the official oath. She wore a sharp charcoal business suit that contrasted starkly with the terrified demeanor she had displayed inside her luxury penthouse months earlier. A smug, self-serving smirk danced across her lips as she looked directly at the jury. She had secured absolute federal immunity and was perfectly willing to burn her former lover to the ground to maintain her own freedom. Guided by the precise questioning of the lead federal prosecutor, she meticulously detailed the absolute depth of Gavin criminal architecture. She did not hesitate to expose the darkest corners of their illicit affair or the financial mechanics of their intended escape. She explained with chilling clarity how Gavin had aggressively targeted my $12 million trust to steal the equity from my home. She testified that the entire objective was to liquidate the stolen assets into untraceable offshore cryptocurrency and completely abandon Olivia with insurmountable tax debts. She stated plainly that Gavin never loved my daughter and viewed her solely as a convenient financial vehicle. He had explicitly planned to leave her to shoulder the crushing weight of federal prosecution while he fled to the Cayman Islands. Valerie recounted their specific travel itineraries and the exact luxury properties they had intended to purchase using the stolen funds. Every word she spoke painted Gavin not as a misguided entrepreneur, but as a ruthless, calculating predator willing to destroy his own wife for a tropical vacation. The prosecution did not stop at Gavin individual crimes. To make matters exponentially worse for the panicked defense team, Valerie pulled a stack of printed spreadsheets directly from the encrypted master laptop she had surrendered to us. She presented the extracted financial ledgers to the court, formally entering them into the public record. These documents were the ultimate death blow to Jonathan's carefully constructed facade of paternal innocence. Valerie methodically proved that Jonathan had personally funded the entire illicit operation from the very beginning. She explained that Gavin Fake Tech startup was never actually designed to produce a legitimate product or generate honest revenue. Instead, it functioned exclusively as a highly sophisticated vehicle to launder money and artificially inflate the assets of Jonathan's failing logistics business. The wealthy CEO had deliberately funneled massive amounts of illicit corporate capital through his son's fake enterprise to hide his own catastrophic financial failures from federal regulators. Valerie testified that Jonathan dictated the specific routing numbers and directly approved the forged commercial loan applications. The father and son were entirely complicit, operating as a unified criminal syndicate. They had orchestrated the entire fraudulent scheme together, sitting in the very same opulent dining room where they had handed me that insulting nursing home brochure. Valerie read aloud the exact text messages between Gavin and Jonathan, completely shattering the defense argument that they were operating independently. The sheer volume of undeniable forensic evidence presented by the mistress completely destroyed the last remaining shreds of their fabricated defense. Jonathan stared at the polished wooden table, his face completely devoid of color, as he realized his own massive ego had provided the exact digital roadmap to his absolute destruction. He had spent decades building an untouchable corporate empire only to watch it systematically dismantled by the exact woman his son had foolishly trusted with their deepest financial secrets. The jury absorbed every single detail with grim, undeniable fascination. The cold, calculated betrayal delivered directly from the witness stand finally broke Gavin's remaining fragile composure. He had spent the entire trial attempting to project the image of a misunderstood victim, but the sheer humiliation of his mistress publicly dissecting his cowardice proved to be too much for his massive, fragile ego. As Valerie read a particularly damning text message where Gavin mocked his own father's business acumen, the arrogant boy completely snapped. He lost his temper in open court, abandoning any pretense of civilized behavior. He violently kicked his chair backward, the heavy wood scraping loudly against the floor, and lunged aggressively toward the witness box. His face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage as he screamed vile graphic obscenities at Valerie. The heavy steel chains binding his wrists and ankles clanked sharply as he fought against the physical restraints, desperately trying to reach the woman who had just guaranteed his lengthy prison sentence. The violent outburst was exactly the type of volatile, arrogant behavior he had tried so hard to conceal from the jury. He completely validated every single negative character assessment the prosecution had presented. Two heavily armed court bailiffs reacted with immediate, forceful precision. They rushed the defense table, grabbing Gavin aggressively by the shoulders and slamming him back down into his seat. They physically subdued him, pressing their weight against his struggling frame until he stopped thrashing. The shocking display of physical aggression cemented his true nature directly into the minds of the judge and the jury. He was not a sophisticated businessman or a tragic victim of circumstance. He was a dangerous, unstable predator throwing a violent tantrum because his malicious toys had finally been taken away. The presiding federal judge slammed his heavy wooden gavel repeatedly against the sounding block, his voice booming with absolute furious authority over the chaotic noise of the courtroom. He ordered the bailiffs to secure the defendant and immediately held Gavin in extreme legal contempt of court. The judge issued a blistering reprimand condemning my son-in-law for his complete lack of respect for the judicial process and his dangerous inability to control his violent impulses. The stern judicial rebuke echoed through the massive room, solidifying the jury's absolute disdain for the defendants. The 12 men and women sitting in the jury box looked at Gavin with profound, visible disgust, entirely repulsed by the pathetic display of arrogant entitlement. Any microscopic shred of sympathy the defense attorneys had managed to cultivate was permanently eradicated by Gavin's own lack of discipline. The defense counsel buried their faces in their hands, realizing their client had just single-handedly destroyed their entire carefully constructed legal strategy in a matter of seconds. Following the violent interruption, Valerie calmly concluded her testimony, completely unbothered by the pathetic outburst she had just provoked. She stepped down from the witness stand and confidently walked out of the courtroom, having successfully secured her own freedom by guaranteeing their total incarceration. The lead federal prosecutor stood tall and formally announced that the state rested its initial phase of witnesses. The heavy anticipation in the room shifted entirely. The foundation had been perfectly laid and the enemy defenses were completely shattered. It was time for the final definitive testimony. I slowly stood up from my seat directly behind the prosecution table. I adjusted my gold tie clip, smoothed the front of my tailored charcoal suit, and prepared to take the stand to deliver the absolute killing blow. I stood up from my seat directly behind the prosecution table. I adjusted the solid gold tie clip resting against my tailored charcoal suit and walked deliberately toward the witness stand. I maintained the immaculate, uncompromising posture of a man who had spent 4 decades commanding troops across the most hostile environments on the globe. The packed federal courtroom fell into an absolute breathless silence as I raised my right hand to take the official oath, my voice resonating with deep, practiced authority. I sat down in the wooden witness box and looked directly at the 12 men and women sitting in the jury box. Guided by the lead federal prosecutor, I began to systematically recount the events of that fateful Christmas dinner. I detailed exactly how Jonathan and Patricia had invited me into their opulent mansion, entirely expecting to humiliate a vulnerable, broke senior citizen. I described the faded olive-drab military coat I had intentionally worn to test their true character and evaluate their baseline morality. I explained the sheer disrespect radiating from Gavin as he arrogantly boasted about his fraudulent technology startup while openly mocking my quiet lifestyle. I painted a vivid, undeniable picture of the exact moment Jonathan slid a crisp, white envelope across the polished mahogany table. I told the jury about the insulting brochure for a low-income state-funded nursing home and the meager $500 check they expected me to trade my entire livelihood for. I detailed their arrogant assumption that I was a helpless, financially ruined victim who could be easily bullied into surrendering a multi-million-dollar residential property. I made sure the jury understood that their entire criminal conspiracy was built on a foundation of profound entitlement and absolute moral bankruptcy. The prosecutor then asked me to formally state my professional background for the public record. I looked directly at the defense table where Gavin and Jonathan sat slouched in their bright orange prison jumpsuits. I stated clearly and deliberately that I had served the United States Army for 40 years, ultimately retiring with the rank of 4-star general in charge of global military logistics. I detailed the sheer scope of my former command, explaining how I had successfully managed billions of dollars in federal assets and highly complex international supply chains. Following my military credentials, the prosecutor submitted my complete unredacted financial portfolio into evidence. I confirmed under oath that I collected a secure monthly military pension of $36,000. I verified my absolute legal control over a $12 million blind trust, which included the residential property Gavin had attempted to steal and the massive commercial warehouse Jonathan relied upon to keep his failing logistics empire afloat. The defense team's entire fabricated narrative of me being a confused, broke old man who was easily manipulated by his environment was utterly decimated. The sheer undeniable weight of my factual achievements crashed down upon the courtroom. The jurors listened with rapt, undeniable respect. Several of them openly glared at the defense table, thoroughly disgusted by the sheer audacity of two men who had attempted to defraud a highly decorated military veteran. My testimony completely stripped away the final remnants of Jonathan and Gavin's manufactured victimhood. They were not desperate businessmen making honest mistakes. They were calculating predators who had aggressively targeted a man they believed could not fight back, completely unaware they had provoked a seasoned tactician. The federal prosecutor paced slowly across the courtroom floor before asking the most crucial question of the entire trial. He asked why I did not immediately stop the fraud the very moment Jonathan handed me the nursing home brochure, or the second my legal counsel discovered the forged power of attorney. I leaned forward slightly and explained my tactical reasoning with absolute chilling clarity. I told the jury that a commanding officer never interrupts an enemy who is in the active process of making a fatal, unrecoverable mistake. I stayed completely silent at that dining table to gather essential intelligence. I allowed them to fully execute their fraudulent commercial loan application and initiate their illicit wire transfers because I needed them to legally hang themselves with their own documentation. I wanted the federal authorities to have a pristine, undeniable paper trail of their corruption that no expensive corporate lawyer could ever dismantle. But beyond the rigid legal strategy, I explained my deepest, most personal motivation. I looked toward the public gallery where my daughter Olivia sat watching the proceedings. I told the court that I needed to allow Gavin to fully expose his absolute lack of morality. If I had simply paid off his debts or stopped the loan application quietly, my daughter would have spent the rest of her life believing she was married to a good man who merely suffered a string of bad luck. I needed the toxic illusion to shatter completely. I required Gavin to expose his unvarnished, cruel character under the bright lights of a federal investigation to ensure Olivia could finally see the truth and permanently break free from his psychological control. The prosecution formally concluded their direct examination and yielded the floor. The presiding federal judge turned his attention to the defense table, asking if they wished to cross-examine the witness. The lead defense attorney slowly stood up. He looked at his extensive legal notepad, then looked at Gavin, and finally looked at Jonathan. The highly paid corporate lawyer was completely pale and visibly defeated. He realized he had absolutely zero ammunition to use against a decorated 4-star general possessing an airtight forensic paper trail. Attempting to interrogate me or question my cognitive abilities after my flawless commanding testimony would only infuriate the jury further and insult the intelligence of the court. The attorney swallowed hard, shook his head, and officially declined to cross-examine. There was absolutely nothing left to argue. I was formally excused from the witness stand. I stood up, buttoned my tailored charcoal suit jacket, and walked back to my seat behind the prosecution table with steady, measured steps. The evidentiary phase of the trial was officially over. The judge leaned forward and began issuing his final comprehensive instructions to the jury outlining the massive federal charges of wire fraud, identity theft, bribery, and grand larceny. The bailiffs unlocked the heavy wooden doors and the 12 jurors solemnly filed out of the courtroom to begin their deliberations. The massive room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. Gavin and Jonathan were left sitting motionlessly at the defense table, their wrists bound in heavy steel chains. They stared blankly at the large analog clock ticking relentlessly on the courtroom wall, completely paralyzed as they waited for their inevitable catastrophic fate. The heavy mahogany clock on the courtroom wall ticked with agonizing slowness. Less than a single hour had passed since the jury retreated to their secure deliberation chamber. For sprawling federal cases involving massive corporate fraud, offshore money laundering, and complex medical conspiracy verdicts typically required days of agonizing debate. The sudden sharp buzz of the bailiff intercom shattered the suffocating tension hanging over the room. The jury had already reached a unanimous decision. The heavy oak doors swung open, and the 12 men and women filed back into the jury box with grim, resolute expressions. Not a single juror looked toward the defense table. The presiding federal judge instructed the defendants to stand and face the court. Gavin and Jonathan rose slowly from their wooden chairs, their bright orange prison jumpsuits rustling loudly against the heavy steel chains binding their ankles. The jury foreman stood tall, holding a stack of official verdict forms firmly in his hands. He leaned into the microphone, his voice echoing with absolute, unforgiving clarity across the silent gallery. Guilty on the primary charge of federal wire fraud. Guilty on the charge of aggravated identity theft. Guilty on the charge of judicial subversion and medical conspiracy. Guilty on the final charge of attempted extortion. With every single pronouncement, the crushing weight of reality slammed into the Stanford men. The crowded public gallery erupted in validated murmurs of profound approval, the collective sound serving as an undeniable testament to the absolute, highly publicized destruction of their illicit empire. The federal judge slammed his heavy wooden gavel against the sounding block, demanding absolute silence from the gallery before he delivered the final sentencing. He leaned forward, fixing an icy, uncompromising glare directly upon the two men standing before him. He did not speak to them as wealthy corporate titans or ambitious entrepreneurs. He addressed them as common predatory criminals who possessed a profound lack of basic human morality. The judge explicitly condemned their calculated, vicious behavior toward a senior citizen and a highly decorated military veteran. He stated that their decision to weaponize the psychiatric medical system to falsely imprison a family member for sheer financial gain was one of the most reprehensible acts of greed he had witnessed in his entire judicial career. He tore into Jonathan's utter failure as a father, noting that instead of guiding his son toward honest success, he had actively funded and encouraged his devastating descent into federal crime. The reprimand was absolutely scathing, systematically stripping away the last remaining shreds of their manufactured dignity. The judge made it completely clear that their vast wealth and former elite social standing would afford them zero leniency in his courtroom. He picked up his official pen and delivered the final, devastating blow. He sentenced Gavin to 25 consecutive years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. He then turned his fierce gaze directly to Jonathan, sentencing the former logistics CEO to 30 consecutive years, ensuring the arrogant businessman would spend the rest of his natural life staring at cold concrete walls. The sheer magnitude of the consecutive sentences washed violently over the defendants. There would be no comfortable white-collar resort prisons. They were heading directly into the harsh, unforgiving reality of the maximum security federal penal system. Federal marshals immediately stepped forward, grabbing the condemned men firmly by their shoulders to execute the transfer. The heavy steel chains clanked loudly against the polished floor as Gavin and Jonathan were forcefully turned away from the defense table. The complete physical realization of their lost freedom settled over them in a suffocating wave of despair. As the armed guards marched them down the center aisle toward the holding cell doors, Gavin stopped and looked back over his shoulder. His eyes found mine across the crowded courtroom. The arrogant boy who had smugly mocked my quiet lifestyle at the Christmas dinner was completely gone. He was entirely stripped of his unearned power, his stolen wealth, and his pathetic, grandiose illusions. He stared at me with absolute hollow terror, finally understanding that he had thrown away a beautiful marriage and a prosperous future for a tropical fantasy that never actually existed. Jonathan paused right behind his son, his face aged by a decade in the span of a single afternoon. The wealthy logistics titan looked back at the gallery, searching desperately for his wife, but Patricia had already fled the courthouse to avoid the flashing cameras of the local press. Jonathan looked at me, a broken, defeated man who had systematically traded his entire legacy for a prison cell. He realized in that agonizing final moment that my faded military coat held infinitely more honor, power, and respect than his multi-million-dollar empire ever did. I did not offer them a single ounce of sympathy. I maintained my rigid, uncompromising posture, staring them down until the heavy wooden doors swung shut behind them. The Stanford men were permanently erased from our lives, reduced to nothing but inmate numbers, facing a desolate, agonizing lifetime behind cold steel bars. The presiding judge struck his gavel for the final time, the sharp echo officially adjourning the court and closing the chapter on the Stanford family's reign of deceit. The suffocating tension that gripped the room for weeks instantly evaporated, replaced by the collective exhale of a gallery witnessing absolute justice. I stood up from my seat, buttoning my tailored charcoal suit jacket with deliberate, measured precision. Thomas shook my hand firmly, a silent acknowledgement of the flawless tactical execution we had orchestrated from the shadows of our hotel penthouse. The federal prosecutors gathered their files, nodding respectfully in my direction as we prepared to exit the battlefield. The war was officially over, and the enemy had been completely neutralized without compromising my personal integrity. I turned toward the gallery and extended my arm to my daughter. Olivia stood up, her posture remarkably straight, radiating a quiet, undeniable strength that filled my chest with profound paternal pride. She did not shed a single tear for the criminal dragged away in chains. She took my arm confidently, entirely free from the psychological manipulation Gavin had weaponized against her. We walked together down the center aisle, passing the murmuring reporters and the stunned spectators. We pushed through the heavy doors of the federal courthouse and stepped outside. The bitter winter chill that defined this entire conflict was completely gone, replaced by a crisp spring afternoon. The bright sun instantly warmed my face, casting a golden light over the city streets. The storm had finally passed, washing away the toxic rot that attempted to infiltrate our lives. Olivia walked proudly beside me, fully ready to reclaim her absolute independence. The time for ruthless tactical destruction had ended. The time for peaceful rebuilding had officially arrived. 3 months passed since the heavy oak doors of the federal courthouse swung shut behind the Stanford men. The vast, corrupt empire Jonathan had spent a lifetime building was systematically dismantled by the federal government. Every commercial warehouse, every offshore bank account, and every luxury estate was aggressively liquidated to compensate the defrauded investors and settle the massive tax liabilities. Patricia was forced to move into a tiny rented apartment on the far outskirts of the city, completely stripped of the high society status she valued above human decency. I did not revel in their misery. I simply returned to my property to erase the physical scars they had attempted to leave behind. The contractor Gavin hired had taken a heavy sledgehammer to the load-bearing walls of my private study before I halted the demolition. I hired a master carpenter to painstakingly restore the original mahogany paneling. We rebuilt the damaged framework, reinforcing the structural integrity of the house until it was stronger than it had been before the intrusion. I unpacked my heavy boxes and carefully arranged my cherished collection of historical literature back onto the newly polished shelves. I opened velvet cases and placed my military medals along the mantel, aligning the silver and bronze stars with exact tactical precision. The house was no longer a contested battlefield. It was a secure sanctuary. The lingering scent of cheap construction dust was completely replaced by the comforting aroma of old paper and wood polish. Olivia received the final divorce decree in the mail on a crisp Tuesday morning. The heavy legal document officially severed her remaining ties to the convicted federal inmate who had systematically attempted to destroy her reality. She did not shed a single tear as she signed the final acknowledgement papers. The deep psychological fog Gavin had aggressively pumped into her life was completely eradicated. Free from his constant toxic manipulation, she stepped fully into the light of her own fierce independence. She utilized her recovered personal savings to launch her own consulting firm, bypassing the corporate ladders dominated by arrogant men who reminded her of her former husband. She refused to take on reckless debt, funding her operations strictly through her own hard-earned capital and securing clients through undeniable competence. She took absolute charge of her career, negotiating contracts with the same uncompromising firmness I had modeled in the bank lobby. She no longer sought validation from loud, boastful men who used wealth as a weapon to mask their deep internal cowardice. Olivia carried herself with a quiet, undeniable dignity. She visited me every Sunday afternoon, walking through the front door with her head held high and her shoulders squared. We sat on the back patio drinking coffee and discussing her growing business ventures. I watched my daughter rebuild her spirit brick by brick, realizing she had inherited the exact same strategic resilience her mother Martha had possessed. She recognized her own profound worth, establishing impenetrable boundaries that no predator could ever cross again. The terrified, weeping woman who had cowered in the corner of the First National Bank was entirely gone. In her place stood a formidable architect of her own destiny, absolutely refusing to apologize for her strength. The war with the Stanford family exposed a critical vulnerability operating quietly within our society. Gavin had targeted me because he assumed a senior citizen was naturally defenseless against aggressive financial manipulation. I possessed the military training, the $12 million trust, and the brilliant legal counsel required to launch a devastating counteroffensive. Most elderly veterans facing similar predatory abuse had absolutely nothing. I decided to utilize my vast personal wealth to permanently alter that unacceptable reality. I partnered directly with Thomas to establish a robust, comprehensive legal foundation specifically designed to protect vulnerable senior veterans from familial and corporate financial exploitation. We secured a prime office space downtown and hired a ruthless team of forensic accountants and aggressive litigators. We transformed my traumatic personal experience into a massive, impenetrable shield for others. When a greedy relative attempted to forge a power of attorney or a corrupt medical professional tried to manufacture a fake dementia diagnosis, our foundation deployed overwhelming legal force to crush the threat instantly. We provided free emergency legal representation, preventing predators from silently draining the bank accounts of men and women who had honorably served this country. I personally oversaw the foundation operations, reviewing case files with the exact same tactical scrutiny I used to evaluate enemy troop movements. We coordinated with federal authorities to ensure swift, uncompromising prosecution of these cowardly offenses. We dismantled fraudulent guardianships and recovered stolen life savings, ensuring that no arrogant thief could ever view an aging veteran as an easy target. The painful betrayal I endured was successfully converted into a highly effective weapon for absolute justice. The harsh winter freeze finally surrendered to the steady warmth of a new season. I sat comfortably in my restored private study, watching the bright flames crackle steadily inside the large stone fireplace. I wore my faded olive drab military coat, the exact same worn garment that had triggered Jonathan and Gavin's arrogant, fatal miscalculation at the Christmas dinner. It felt incredibly comfortable against my shoulders, a quiet testament to 40 years of disciplined, uncompromising service. I held a ceramic mug of strong black coffee, letting the bitter, rich steam rise into the quiet room. I reflected on the entire intense campaign, from the initial insult to the final courtroom gavel. The enemy had relied entirely on loud, aggressive intimidation and the shallow projection of unearned wealth. They believed shouting threats and waving forged documents equated to genuine power. I had defeated them by utilizing the exact opposite approach. I realized all over again that true unshakable strength does not reside in loud arrogance or flashy displays of dominance. It exists in the capacity for silent strategic resilience. It is the ability to absorb an unexpected blow, assess the battlefield without emotion, and strike back with absolute, overwhelming precision. The Stanford men were locked in concrete cages because they failed to understand the lethal danger of a quiet, observant man. The order of my life was permanently restored not by luck, but by calculated, uncompromising action. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, enjoying the profound, absolute peace of a secured fortress. The war was definitively won, and my family was finally safe. Sitting in the quiet solitude of my restored study, watching the winter frost melt into the promise of an early spring, I find myself contemplating the true nature of legacy. For decades, I believed that providing financial security was the ultimate expression of paternal love. I assumed that by purchasing a home outright and funding trust accounts, I was building an impenetrable fortress around my daughter. I was profoundly, terribly mistaken. The most vital, enduring lesson this grueling ordeal taught me is that unearned wealth does not create security. Unearned wealth attracts predators. We live in a deeply flawed society that aggressively equates material abundance with personal character. We are taught to look at tailored suits, luxury vehicles, and sprawling estates as undeniable proof of success and moral superiority. Jonathan and his son built their entire identities on that shallow, fragile premise. They believed that because they possessed expensive things, they inherently possessed power over those they deemed lesser. They viewed my faded military coat not as a symbol of service, but as an invitation for exploitation. They equated my silence with ignorance and my patience with weakness. I learned that true power never has to announce its presence. Real strength is cultivated in the dark, forged through decades of disciplined sacrifice and an unwavering commitment to personal integrity. When you know exactly who you are, you do not need to shout your credentials across a mahogany dining table. You do not need to humiliate others to elevate your own standing. You simply observe the battlefield, calculate the structural integrity of your opponent, and strike only when the victory is absolute. This experience fundamentally altered my definition of family. Bloodlines and marriage certificates are merely legal arrangements. True family is an active daily choice rooted in mutual respect and unconditional loyalty. My daughter had to walk through a devastating emotional fire to realize that a husband who demands her subjugation does not actually love her. She learned the agonizing lesson that setting hard, impenetrable boundaries is the highest form of self-care. I learned that my duty as a father did not end when she became an adult. Sometimes the most profound act of parental love is allowing a toxic structure to completely collapse so your child can finally see the rot hidden within the walls. We cannot protect our loved ones from every predator that walks through the front door. We can only equip them with the mental fortitude to recognize the danger and the courage to walk away from the table. The battles we fight in our twilight years are rarely fought with weapons. They are fought with paper patience and the undeniable weight of the truth. Integrity is the only fortress that cannot be foreclosed upon. If you hold your ground and refuse to compromise your fundamental values, the architects of deceit will inevitably construct their own prisons. That is the enduring legacy I will leave behind for my daughter, ensuring she always remembers her absolute worth. Did you find value in my story today? Let me know which city you are listening from down in the comments section. If you enjoyed this video and want to support the channel, please consider sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing you more stories like this. Your support means everything to me. Do not forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss an update. I look forward to seeing you in the next life story.